Title: DCC Campaign Archive. You can cast anything you want at the darkness. But you can't cast that date, January 10th, 2015. In this week's adventure, our stalwart heroes who were deep within the lost dwarven machine hold, surrounded by brain-eaters, learned that an elven prisoner, driven mad through the death of their patron, will begin to act more rationally than even normal elves do. That said, prisoner's tooth on a stick is not a magic wand, it's just one of their own teeth on a stick. That they are now one car tire shoulder pad away from being characters in a Mad Max movie. That you cannot in fact cast magic missile at the darkness. That you can in fact fire blasters at the darkness. That you can also cast choking cloud at the darkness, throw a grenade at the darkness, toss an axe at the darkness, throw a tooth on a stick at the darkness, and even cast darkness at the darkness. You can even curse the darkness. You just can't cast magic missile at it. That brain-eaters are non-copyrighted tentacle-headed monsters from the void that eat your brains. That a pit trap becomes pretty irrelevant when you find out that brain-eaters can also levitate. That brain-eaters are pretty god-awful at interior design. That when a cold mutant taps your shoulder and says, "Excuse me, meester," it probably means another cold mutant is about to hit you on the head with a club in a coup attempt. That a band of dwarven warriors on a quest to retake their homeland will never give up, even when there's only one dwarf left, and said homeland is infested with possibly hundreds of brain-eaters. That brain-eaters are telepaths, but also communicate through tentacle-waving Zoidberg-like blub-blub noises. That trying to use ventriloquism to simulate said blub noise will have little effect, even if you try to do it in what you imagine would be a seductive tone. That switching to beatboxing blub noises will be even less effective. That the Lord of all flesh is totally on board with invoking his power to result in brain-eater tentacle porn. That, disturbingly, servants of the Lord of all flesh eventually figure out how to weaponize their patrons' orgiastic excesses and, more disturbingly, nickname it sexy time. That once you've rescued the Azure Order novice that was to be sacrificed at the Sky Rock alignment to put out the sun, it's time to get the hell out of Tentacle Town for the sake of saving the world. That if the last remaining dwarven prince is determined to stay behind and fight to retake his homeland, you might as well spellburn drain him to death and take all his stuff. That Cesrican approves of dwarven regicide. That Cesrican wouldn't really go so far as to call the Azure Order dicks dangerously naive, hopelessly optimistic, and annoyingly altruistic, sure, but not dicks. That when he has absolutely no choice, Bill the Elf will reluctantly do the right thing. The right thing, in his mind, being not killing the innocent Azure Order novice and not teleporting away while abandoning all his teammates to a grisly tentacle-to-filled demise. That you might save the entire universe twice, and that still won't get you a seat on the Azure Order High Council. It's enough to make certain wizards turn to the dark side, if they hadn't technically already done so long ago. That the Azure Order believes in cooperative co-teaching in their instructional seminars. That the downside of casting patron bond at the figurative darkness is that you might just end up with the extremely senile King of Elfland as your patron. That one thing you should never try to do is be an Indian giver with Cesrican. That referring to the Lord of all flesh as fun during an Azure Order seminar is highly likely to earn you looks of extreme suspicion from the High Council, and not likely at all to help your chances of eventual political advancement in said order. That getting funny looks from everyone in the order might mark a good time to consider getting some distance from the order, especially when you've started to grow extra mouths in all the wrong places. That for some reason Bill the Elf believes planar step works best when cast from one bathroom to another bathroom. That when you show up in Ice Dome Zero and there's a mob of angry cold mutants waiting for you, there's at least one guy in the crowd that will shout "kill them" in answer to absolutely anything you say. That it's really hard to tell with cold mutants whether they're saying that the dwarf felt has died or is only visiting a series of local regional landmarks that all sound like colorful indigenous euphemisms for dying. That promising to restore lights, heating, and food to Ice Dome Zero can eventually win over the new decider and earn an uneasy truce with the cold mutants. Though there'll still always be that one asshole who keeps shouting "kill them." That the cold mutants have no need of this elven drink they call mocha, cappuccinos, because they drink the congealed blood of the land whale. That actually, upon tasting this elven drink, they realize that the congealed blood of the land whale tastes like absolute shit. That apparently Feld, son of Feldstein, has not died in some flowery euphemistic way, and has in fact managed to run off somewhere with all of Tiamat's treasure hoard after somehow blowing a hole in a magical barrier that should have been impossible to open. That revenge and the recovery of this vast treasure can wait, while the PCs first recover from their recent ordeals, and while Bill the Elf uses a combination of high thaumaturgy and narcotics to create his new wizard staff called the Primo Staff, that to his great pleasure, the staff manages to have the special effect he desired, that of causing extreme psychedelic disorientation to anyone it comes in contact with. That, to his infinite regret, these effects diminish on an individual over time the more frequently they come in contact with the staff, as they build up a tolerance. Because Bill the Elf mainly wanted to use his staff on himself, a lot. Title: DCC Campaign Update. I love you, Dr. Theobald. Date: January 24, 2015. Author: RPG Pundit. URL: thorpg.blogspot.com/2015-01/DCC-campaign-update-I-love-u.html. In today's adventure, the PCs were surprised to find that they'd figured out a new method to get rid of cold mutant deciders. Get them high with a magic staff, and then have their own people throw them off a balcony. That the cold mutants don't care much for visions. The old shaman used to get those, and they threw him off something for it. That the universal tactic for kidnapping someone throughout the various planes even is to tap someone on the shoulders and say, "Excuse me, mister," while a partner sucker punches them from behind. That their party's cleric can be completely missing for well over 24 hours without anyone even noticing. That for Rakandra to only steal the nominal sum of 10 EP from your party mate's room while investigating their possible kidnapping is being nice. That it doesn't matter how much you turn up the heat in Ice Dome Zero, cold mutants are always cold, it's just a racial trait. That the plane of Jade is ruled over by the extremely old Jade Empress, who has been kidnapping the handsomest humanoids in all the material plane to have them participate in the games to see which will be her consort for life. That she means their life, not hers, since material plane humanoids are absurdly short-lived compared to Jade people. That by games, she means a series of duels to the death, using what they call Thunderdome rules. That Jade people don't know much about the biology of carbon-based humanoids from the material plane, and didn't actually know the difference between humans and elves. That if you're a cleric in this party and you've been kidnapped, you hold no hope or expectation that your team mates will bother to rescue you. So plan B for you is to convince the Jade people to kidnap your whole party too. That Rakandra, even in male form, registers as female to Jade people censors. That when in doubt on these matters, the Jade people use something called the probe to make sure. That the probe is not nearly as ominous or uncomfortable as it sounds. That when you need to understand a bit more of the context of Jade person society, you need to get the help of a historiologist and a carbonologist as well. That you can tell who the historiologist is because of his ridiculous hat. That the Jade court is getting quite desperate, as the Empress is pretty venerable at this point, and still hasn't been able to produce a single heir from any of her material realm consorts. That the basic birds and bees of just how Jade people reproduce, it involves chips, shavings off their bodies, doesn't in any way sound like something any humanoid has any business or indeed even capability of being involved in. That in fact it's biologically impossible for Jade people and humanoids from a completely different plane to reproduce together. But no one in the plane of Jade had realized this until just now. That Chalk, the cold mutant, who got kidnapped by accident with the PCs, thinks that the Jade Empress's interest in humans who live 1/1,000th her lifespan and don't seem compatible with her reproductive needs sounds a little bit like what a guy in his tribe named Orkuk the penguin lover gets up to. That actually someone had apparently realized this before now and is quite willing to murder Jade people scientists in order to keep the secret. That the whole thing may be a setup from within, and the Jade Empress has been in it all along because as soon as she produces a male heir, she won't be in power anymore. that the game's coordinator has started to figure out what the scientist died for, and after getting the whole story from Rakandra and realizing that, he's been forced to run over 1 million games in his career instead of just one. He's come to the conclusion that the Empress is a complete bitch. That, even when presented with a viable escape plan to get the fuck out of there and be done with it, the party decides to stay, because they haven't really done their job if they don't utterly ruin every place they visit. That Bill the Elf in particular won't be satisfied if he doesn't leave the plane of Jade in utter politico-social chaos and possible civil war. That things get complicated when the game's coordinator has mysteriously disappeared. Now the historiologist has to be the new coordinator, because that's the natural line of succession. That no one in any of the various cultures of the last sun seemed to have any rational way of organizing anything. That the old coordinator may have been murdered by the Empress's chief intelligencer, Lord Wallhead. That Wallhead's agent, named Stone, Jade Stone, has a few questions for the PCs. That while Stone learns very little from them, the PCs are able to deduct from Stone's questioning that in fact the coordinator is not dead. Unfortunately, he does seem to have used the Jade Empire's Great Planar Gate to flee into hiding, in fear of his life, and won't be of any help in getting Bill his violent revolution. That while Jade people don't need to eat organic matter, they realize that their humanoid captives do, so they provide them with decorative crystal baskets of colorful fruit. That since Jade people also don't have any need for toilets, the decorative crystal baskets, once bereft of fruit, serve a dual purpose. That while the rest of the PCs will now have to fight to the death in the games, Rakandra may be of some help in any future plans, as she has had a request granted to remain on the plane of Jade as a spectator of the games, and been invited to spend the games in the Empress's box. That the Empress's box is not a reference to her special area in the Thunderdome, but to a literal small locked box next to the Empress's viewing throne. That the first day of the games would consist of 16 gladiatorial fights among 32 contestants, and the next day would be the round of 16 feet. That among the other prisoners present for this round of the games are a savage-looking ape-man, some kind of insect man, a human peasant with a bucket, and a frog, a tough-looking ranger, a floating wizard with enough corruption and patron taint on him to make it obvious he's really powerful, a non-floating wizard who is clearly of lower level, a sneaky rogue that may be from Arkhome, an emo elf, an ogre named Trog who seems to be the only person that actually willingly wants to participate, a hapless cleric named Marvin, and a bunch of guys who look like first-level cannon fodder. That the savage-looking ape-man is actually named Dr. Theobald, and is an erudite scholar with an upper-crust English accent and a pipe. The peasant with the bucket for a helmet, on the other hand, is named Jethro Bucket, and he really is a moron. That there's also a last-minute replacement for Rakandra, who is a barbarian warrior babe in bikini chainmail named Sandy, that is 100% biologically female, pretty much proving that the jig is up and everyone in power knows the games are a scam. That after a lot of arguing, getting 32 adventurers to agree on anything is pretty hard. The plan becomes to make it seem that the Empress reveals her deception to her people and then kill her, making it look like a suicide if possible by magically pushing her off the balcony, but if not, just magic missiling her to death, in the hopes of causing an immediate succession war and hightailing it out of the dimension with as much loot as they can steal, before anyone notices. That in order to stop Trog the ogre from spilling the beans, you just have trick him into eating Jethro's hallucinogenic frog. That if you're stuck in the Empress box waiting for the Empress to arrive and the games to start, it's probably not a good idea to hint at your plan to kill the Empress to some random noble who sat down next to your box. That it's a particularly bad idea if that random noble turns out to be Lord Wallhead, the Empress's royal intelligencer. That since Rakandra is a threat to the Empress, and the Empress box cannot be opened except by her command, the only solution for Wallhead is to take the whole box with Rakandra in it to his offices. That when you're left alone inside a locked jade box in the headquarters of the secret police, it's convenient that you have a constant magic missile floating around your head to gradually carve your way out of the box. That the whole elaborate plan to kill the Empress at the start of the games is only any good until your keen elven eyes realize That's not the Empress up on the balcony, but her body double. That a cleric can save the day by using word of command to force everyone in the Empress balcony to confess. That everyone in the royal balcony had some dark secret to tell. Except that one guard who's really fucking boring, though he confesses he secretly wishes he could have something interesting to confess. That the Empress's body double speaks in an Australian accent for no good reason. That Wallhead's assistant confirms that in fact the Royal Council had known about her plan all along, and the Empress just doesn't give a shit what happens to the Jade Empire after she finally croaks childless. That at least one distant member of the royal family was already planning to assassinate the Empress and try to take power. That the accumulated weight of all these secrets causes a general panic among the crowd. That the Jade Guard are rendered less effective without anyone to give them immediate orders once the Ranger fires a grenade arrow into the royal balcony, causing all the people ostensibly in charge to flee for their lives. That Jade Guardsmen are really tough. Like, survive a grenade arrow tough. That if you get out of the Empress's box and leave behind a pair of cobalt mines as a trap for Lord Wallhead when he returns, it would have been better to make damn sure you were going to be farther away than the front lawn when the mines get triggered. And ideally you'd have been wise to make sure it was Wallhead who triggered them, and not Agent Jade Stone, of Her Majesty's Secret Jade Service, who already desperately wants to use his license to kill on you. That, with enough teamwork, getting out of the Thunderdome arena would probably be a real possibility, so, of course, the 32 adventurers almost immediately split into various groups with completely different plans. About 18 of them die almost immediately too. That Dr. Theobald is a cool ape under pressure, and a good ape to have when you're trying to find the way out of Thunderdome and over to the planar gate to destroy it. Not so much so that the Jade Empress can't keep kidnapping humanoids from the material plane to use in her death matches, but so that the Jade Empress can't get any ideas of sending revenge squads after you personally. Never let it be said this PC party did anything for purely selfless reasons. That when you're about to be brutally murdered by a 100% Jade version of 007, if you're a member of this PC party, you will gladly sell out your teammates' plan to save your own hide. That, with just about every royal guardsman busy protecting the royal palace from complete chaos, the Jade Empire Institute of Jade Sciences is practically undefended, except by Jade Empire science nerds. That even a Jade nerd fight can be pretty dangerous, given that Jade nerd fists do a D8+, 1 damage, and the average Jade nerd has 7 times more hit points than the average human. That if you're the Jade nerd scientist who invented the planar gate, and probably the only one who could rebuild it, it's probably a bad idea to say so in an angry nerd tone to the guys who just came in to destroy the gate forever. That things only get worse when Secret Agent Jade Stone busts down the door ready to shoot at anything in his path using Ricandra as a human, or rather elven, shield. That Sandy the Bikini Chainmail Barbarian can fortunately kick Agent Jade Stone's Jade ass, particularly with a bit of help from Jethro Bucket, who has turned out to be a surprisingly efficient, zero-level redneck. That when the planar gate is destroyed, the Jade secret agent is dead, and an entire plane is plunged into social ruin. It's time to planewalk it out of there back to Ice Dome Zero, and to take the survivors of the games with you, which happen to be Dr. Theobald, Sandy the Bikini, Chainmail Warrior Woman, Jethro Bucket, Jal Udine the Backstabbing Rogue, and Marvin the Cleric. That was it for this session. Good fun was, as always, had by all. Now, the PCS plan to recover. Try to talk Dr. Theobald to stay on. He's rapidly become their favorite ape-man scientist, but he plans to return to the Southern Ape Kingdoms as quickly as possible, and finally get down to the business of tracking down Feld, son of Feldstein, the dwarf and the stolen treasure hoard of Tiamat. Addendum. A note on DCC elves. Someone asked me if Elven Barista came out of a misreading, an intentional one. In this case, similar to accidental misreadings that has been made before, of the Elven barrister profession. Well, sort of. Before the campaign even started, I read that and thought barista, and then came up with the idea that in my DCC world all the elves are useless hipsters, essentially the trust fund babies of the last sun, living in the illusory security of their dome cities where their every need is cared for by machines and They are free to argue about fashion, drink increasingly complex beverages, and pretend they're writing a novel. The whole thing being a long, slow decadence, since the ancients vanished, and God went mad, and the dwarves were driven out of their machine holds by the dark ones, so there's nothing to keep the systems the elves depend on going. Most of the domes already failed, the remaining hipster elves in the remaining domes happily whittle away their lives on trivialities, not realizing that the machines they depend on will sooner or later screw up, and then they'll all be dead because of how useless they are, or almost. Always, there's in each generation a handful of useful elves, among which we hope are the PCs. Later on in the campaign, it was revealed that there are more than just one type of elves. There were, beside the hipster elves, also the smug elves and the emo elves, both of which also live in domes. There was also apparently some great kick-ass empire of warrior elves known as the Pythian Knights, who totally destroyed themselves, it would seem, several thousand years back. They had fleets of skyships and apparently lived up on the flying rocks that orbit the sun. It's not yet clear what relation, if any, these elves had to the dome elves. Title: DCC Campaign Update. Some sorta apocalypse now scenario date, February 5, 2015. In today's adventure, slightly shorter than usual due to character creation and a long dinner, the bold adventurers found that Bill the Elf has a long-term plan to commit extremely slow genocide on the cold mutants by having them execute their own decider over and over again. That it seems kind of silly to do an invoke patron to try to get Cesrican to grant you some kind of magical item of comprehend languages when you're sitting on a pile of high-tech elven universal translators. That all elven technology makes the same boop-beep noises when they in use, while dwarven tech makes more of a bizz noise. That the old wise woman is pretty much the same character in every tribal society they encounter. That God had, for the first time in maybe 10,000 years, something to say other than there's an emergency going on. Or it's still going on. That, unbelievable as it might seem, Marvin the cleric, who isn't even very high level, is the chosen one. That what he has apparently been charged to do by God is to plug in the sacred USB cable, after bringing it to the Church of St. Ignatius of File Not Found. That it would appear that this is an attempt by God to reload from an earlier version, which would be bad news for any of the daemons. So naturally, half the party is secretly working against this sacred mission that could heal the world. That no one is quite sure just where the sacred USB cable is, but it was last in possession of Archdeacon Hill, a high-level cleric that, according to God, has become too perverse to fulfill his function as the original chosen one. That incredibly, the yokel Jethro Bucket does in fact know where to find Archdeacon Hill at a place originally known as the Cave of Tranquility, where his tribe, the Bucket Tribe, live. That apparently Hill's perversion is that he's done set himself up in some sorta apocalypse now scenario where we all worship him and give him our most attractive cousins. That the Bucket clan are not named because they wear wooden buckets on their head, only Jethro does that, but rather because the entire tribe is one large, massively inbred family. Bucket is just their last name. That the Lord of all flesh is seriously worried about God's plan, but can't really think of any solution other than to give his agent claws for hands. Among the daemons, Cesrican was always the more tactical thinker of the bunch. That in spite of humanity's endangered species status, the Buckets have thus far survived because of three simple policies. 1. Kill all intruders to their territories. 2. Worship Archdeacon Hill and his old-time religion. 3. Marry their own cousins. That Jethro Bucket is ultimately okay with betraying and slaughtering his entire nation. Extended family, so long as he gets to keep his attractive cousin, Cindy Lou Bucket. That Archdeacon Hill might have been hot stuff once, but one massive magic missile later, and all that's left of him are his designer boots. That the Buckets are pretty ferocious fighters, but most are also too damn stupid to simply walk out of a choking cloud. That when Bill the Elf makes the tactical choice to blow up Cindy Lou Bucket, he finds himself obliged immediately afterward to kill Jethro too. That the Bucket tribe mostly wiped out, and the Archdeacon just a pair of smoking boots. The PCs are now free to recover the sacred USB cable as well as the huge piles of gold and jewels that the archdeacon had been hoarding from the yokels for the last several decades, that the PCs must now, to get to the Church of St. Ignatius of File not found, cross through the area which was once known as the Peaceful Plains, but which they learn is now referred to as the Pampas of Destruction. They have been warned it is full of dangers, but none so terrible according to local lore, as a vicious sloth with an automatic weapon of some kind. That, however, their first run in is not with the rumored sloth, but with a horde of 70-plus zombie gauchos on zombie horses and all. It was commented that they're like the Argentine version of the White Walkers. That Marvin the cleric is in no way reassured by the notion that, since he is the chosen one, it will mean God will protect him, since all known evidence points to the contrary. That even a horde of that size can be taken down through careful use of divine wrath combined with a clever application of the sequester spell and a bit of good old-fashioned ultra-violence to kill off the stragglers. That as they approach the ruins of the ancient port of Good Wind, the gentle and sweet stream which has nurtured them thus far turns into hideous polluted mess, and the pampas into a grotesque swamp. That while most of the PCs are distracted trying to view the ruins of Good Wind from a distance, they are almost taken by surprise by a pair of savage river trolls, identifiable by their rubbery skin, hideous stench, and red and white T-shirts. That 75 zombie gauchos are no trouble, but 2 river trolls can damn near slaughter a party of experienced PCs. They have a lot more experience with hooliganism after all. That while he's pretty well useless in combat, Dr. Theobald the Apeman is a valuable guy to have around during a river troll attack because he knows the river troll's regenerative power can be stopped with fire, and his quick experimentation reveals that the polluted river is in fact so polluted as to be highly flammable. That with most of the PCs severely injured by the time the river trolls are slain, and a couple of the new O-level guys ready to level up, the party decides to stop before reaching Port Good Wind to continue on their quest next time. Title: DCC Campaign Update. Kill Bill, the Elf. Date: February 19th, 2015. In this week's regrettable adventure of double-to-crosses and betrayals, the PCs continued to express serious doubts as to whether there was any truth to the idea that just because Marvin, the cleric, was the chosen one, it would in any way mean that he'd get any special protections from God. Discovered that at least one chaos cult had ended up kidnapping the wrong cleric, making mistaken assumptions about who the chosen one was. Had the clerics wondering exactly what universe some of the other player characters lived in, where they could assume that God was even marginally competent at anything. Got suckered by a pit trap, ambushed by the Mouth clan of berserker hooligans, ultra-violent barbarians, notable for their blue and yellow shirts, in the downtown areas of the ruins of Port Goodwind. Witnessed the unlikely scenario of Bill the Elf getting 3 corruptions in a single round of combat. Noted that when accused of being an idiot, Bill the Elf's response was, "Didn't you know that already?" Are only saved from the Mouth clan ambush by the astounding fighting skills of Sandy the Bikini Chainmail Barbarian, some very strategic use of the sequester spell by Dr. Theobald, leading several enraged Mouth hooligans into a trap by impersonating a Bolivian, and by the shocking discovery that Jaludin the Rogue was in fact with the party all along, but is just really good at not being seen. Decide that the Mouth clan hooligans having been momentarily dealt with, but the party being extremely wounded, they decide that the best option would be to hide out for the night in the ruins of a fin de siècle cafe. Discovered that was not a great idea, and that the Café Tortono is really not what it used to be, as the reason there was no sign of Mouth clan hooligans around was because of the giant cafe ooze that was using the ruins as its lair. The place still has tourist value, but there's no longer any good coffee to be found there, and the cost of going in is too great. Choose to run for it, figuring that they're far too wounded to be able to take down a cafe ooze. Discover a series of graffiti wall scrawlings that appear to explain this bizarre place, with the blood-stained palace and the broken obelisk, with a mouth drawn on it, and the overabundance of fake tango bars. Apparently it was once a moderately nice civilization, until the locals began to deify a mad general and his dilettante wife, leading to a mythos-worthy orgy of political, economic, and social self destruction until nothing was left but a pile of rubble inhabited by delusional madmen still trying to pretend they are a great nation, curiously end up finding refuge in a semi-ruined church. Find said church occupied by the decidedly fake cleric shyster Reverendo Oswaldo Hijo de Puta, or as his congregants call him, El Reverendo Hijo de Puta, and his congregation of mostly gullible old women. Accept the opportunity to stay overnight at the church for a donation, but unsurprisingly aren't interested in purchasing the good reverend's holy anointing oil, sin-cleansing soaps, or miracle shrouds, even in spite of him offering a very favorable exchange rate for the good wind peso from the gold piece, blue rate. Remain largely unaware that two of their own party have designs to betray the group and prevent God from rebooting from an earlier version, but so far Bill the Elf has been unable to steal the sacred USB from Marvin the Cleric, being under the suspicious eye of Sandy the bikini chainmail barbarian warrior, who's clearly shown herself to be badass enough to potentially kick the shit out of Bill, while meanwhile Rakandra has to deal with a demon patron. That's just not made for these sorts of intrigues, as the Lord of all flesh is best. Idea thus far is to have Rakandra draw up a magic circle that would conjure up one of the Lord of all flesh's infinite sphincters as a means to spirit the USB away from God's reach forever. Find that the Lord of all flesh does have at least some use, however, when Rakandra is able to cause a spontaneous orgy among the reverend and his congregants as a means to make sure none of them will be able to betray or rob the party as they rest up for the night. Are surprised to discover the next morning that the reverend has spinned this church-profaning debauchery as a miracle. Of course it's a miracle, he says. It would have to be for anyone to want to sleep with most of my congregants. Decide, as a party, to get out of good wind as quickly as possible, as much to Bill the Elf's chagrin, they can't even wreck this civilization, since its inhabitants have already done a sterling job of that themselves. Take advantage of the Reverend Hijo de Puta's offer to have his cousin, Ernesto Hijo de Puta, get them out of town in his Peruvian-drawn cart for only 30,000 pesos, or 12 GP, with the blue exchange rate apiece. Discover, in spite of Bill's best efforts, that Bill the Elf also plans to take advantage of the situation, bribing Ernesto and conspiring with him to have the Mouth Clan hooligans ambush them and kill Marvin. Don't realize, however, that Bill has also overheard Dr. Theobald exposing his planned betrayal. Have concluded that trying to figure out where Jaludin the Rogue is hiding is a bit like playing Where's Waldo. See the shit completely hit the fan as the clerics and Bill race to take each other out first. Watch Bill make a completely ineffectual first strike, managing only to light one of the Peruvians on fire. Are all pretty surprised when it turns out the clerics win, and God actually comes through, incinerating Bill the Elf with a truly serious lightning bolt of divine wrath. Proceed to loot the life's work of Bill's countless misdeeds. Don't know that Bill the Elf had a phylactery in Sezrekan's possession, and the restoration of God. His authority is the one circumstance which would make Sezrekan not hesitate to revive Bill, rather than forget about him. Thus, Bill the Elf's mind, soul, and power come to reside in the body of Valerius the human. Technically, this makes him a human, race, elf-class character. Learn that Valerius the human, before he was lost to the phylactery, was a rogue known as Valerius the Crafty, though he clearly wasn't crafty enough not to fall into Sezrekan's trap, or to convince Sezrekan that he'd be of more use than Bill the Elf. Suspect that Sezrekan might very quickly have come to regret that strategic choice, as Bill the Elf almost immediately blows the elements of surprise and subterfuge in pursuit of quick revenge, putting the entire party on paranoid high alert, and then proceeds to murder Rakandra, the only member of the group that shared his goals of stopping the cleric, leaving himself without potential allies. Our jaw, droppingly shocked to find God save the clerics a second time by teleporting the whole party to safety. See Marvin the cleric start to believe that maybe God really is protecting him as his chosen one. Unanimously agree that this means Marvin will probably die very soon. Note that Valerius the human, formerly Bill the Elf, failed to effectively play Where's Waldo with Jaludin, at the cost of taking a dagger in the lungs and getting captured. Finally get to the end of the pampas of destruction, in the border of the vast southern jungle. get to the moment where it hits them that, with Bill the Elf dead, and without his planar step to rely on, they might never be able to get back to Ice Dome Zero. Also discover that although Dr. Theobald's ape kingdoms are kind of close, it might not be the way to go, as Dr. Theobald admits that, to his embarrassment, as one would expect from an evolved ape society, they keep humans as slaves. Decide to keep Valerius, who they have not been able to decisively figure out is in fact Bill. But all agree he's clearly highly suspicious, bound as a prisoner as they enter the jungle. Quickly discover and try to make a deal with a group of suit-wearing green mutants with suspicious behavior. They seem to know where the Church of St. Ignatius of File Not Found is located, and so the party hand themselves over, in the hopes of bribing their jefe in exchange for being led there. Overhear the green mutants acting quite concerned about the PC's interest in the church, and wondering if the PCs aren't actually part of Aldea, whatever that is. Slowly start to figure out that they've stumbled upon a secret base of some kind of drug dealers, who may in fact be using the old Church of St. Ignatius as their warehouse. Are led to the palatial jungle mansion hideout of El Jefe, who turns out to be none other than Slothy Rodriguez, the Uzi-wielding vicious sloth drug lord they'd been warned about in the last session, or as the players immediately dubbed him, Slothface. There ended the session. It wasn't entirely satisfying. Bill the Elf got what he deserved, and because of his phylactery was able to survive, albeit with shittier physical stats, and having lost most of his impressive amounts of stuff, while Ricandra died a permanent death at Bill's hands that the player could do nothing at all to prevent. Ricandra's player felt it was quite unfair, and it was. It was in character for Bill the Elf to do it, but it was still a deeply shitty and frustrating way for him to go, and I felt quite unsatisfied with how it all went down, and thinking I could have or should have made some other sort of call as a GM there. Now Ricandra's player has come in with a new level 1 graduate, a purple mutant, Cyclops Thief, which I hope he'll come to like as much as Ricandra. Meanwhile, Cesrican's patience with Bill the Elf will only go so far. RPG Pundit. Title: DCC Campaign Update. Bring me the head of Slothy Rodriguez. Date: March 19, 2015. This week's DCC session, after a 4-week hiatus, had a nearly full house of 7 players and featured events worthy of any great gangland movie, full of violence, double-cross, revenge, magic missiles, and dire hippos. In the course of the session, the PCs came face-to-face with Slothy Rodriguez, Uzi-wielding sloth and purple dust kingpin of the great southern jungle. I swear to Christ that I only found this image today, long after I thought up Slothy Rodriguez. Discovered that Slothy's dungeon has a regular cell, and a cell for bound and gagged prisoners. Found Slothy's hospitality left a lot to be desired. Watched Bill the Ex-Elf, who the other PCs suspect of being a traitor, but don't realize is the same guy they killed with divine wrath not 2 days ago, betray them yet again, suggesting to Slothy that the PCs were from the dreaded Theta cartel sent to assassinate him. Discovered just what purple dust does, even to an experienced narcologist like Bill, when he was required to snort a bowlful of it to prove he was not a double agent from something called DEA. Learned, while Bill was sleeping off his purple haze, that Slothy's idea of hospitality left even more to be desired when it came a sumptuous feast of jungle greens and grubs, disliked by all but Dr. Theobald, who noted that the grubs were just like the ones he used to pick out of his girlfriend's fur. Realized just in time that all the not-bound prisoners are about to be shot, while all the bound and gagged prisoners are about to be drenched in oil and burned alive while tied to poles. Find that if there's one thing Slothy Rodriguez can't stand, it's when a good oil-drenched pole immolation is ruined. Watch Slothy's consigliere try to reason with him that it might be better to keep the PCs alive, only to see Slothy declare how sick to death was of that guy giving him advice, and telling him not to kill people was just crossing the line. As usual, decide there's no delicate situation they aren't all too happy to trigger into. A total pandemonium where any possibility of things working out goes straight to hell. Tried to cast darkness at the magic missile, just to mix things up a bit. Engaged in a rather excessive amount of groin stabbing from under the dining room table. Noted an exception to the above from Sandy the bikini chainmail barbarian, who displayed her usual class and panache by charging over said table and engaging in some fork-based eye-gouging instead. Lost track of Marvin, the chosen one of the clerical order who hightailed it out of there in mid-combat with Dr. Theobald, trying to find their own way to the Church of St. Ignatius of File not found, in order to complete the sacred mission of plugging in the sacred USB cable and rebooting the world. Decided that rather than go find them, they'd first engage in some looting with Slothy Rodriguez and most of the upper hierarchy of his cartel lying dead. Fell victim at that point to Bill the ex-elf, who trapped them in the complex's dungeons through creative use of the ward portal spell. Felt certain there must be another way out of said dungeons, what with fire regulations and all. Discovered, unfortunately, that said dungeons were a notable fire hazard. Watched with some dismay as Knight the pirate elf managed to escape the dungeon, but only by having her patron, the senile king of Elfland, teleport her more than 50 years into the future. We're not all trapped down there, Ekbasha the cleric having gone off to try to find Marvin. Discovered that the threat of Los Thetas was not just a paranoid fantasy on Slothy's part, but a real imminent and novel threat. Observed with some amusement that Los Thetas dressed like a mix of paramilitary forces with lucha libre wrestling masks with a big Z on the forehead. Saw the remnants of Slothy's forces trying to put up a valiant defense by unleashing Slothy's dire hippos against the Thetas pickup trucks full of gunmen. Noted, unfortunately, that Dr. Theobald and Marvin had been captured by Los Thetas and were now at risk not only of being executed by the gangsters, but also of being mauled to death by the aforementioned dire hippos. Found that Bill the ex-elf had beaten the rest of the group to the Church of St. Ignatius, but he hadn't beaten the Thetas, who had already captured the place. We're not exactly shocked to discover that the church had been converted by Slothy to be used as his main lab and storage facility for tons and tons of purple dust. Saw Bill the ex-elf's eyes light up in anticipation of the possibility of becoming a one-man drug kingpin after all this was over. We're still mostly stuck in the dungeon while Bill the ex-elf immolated the Theta guards through creative use of the sequester spell. Saw Bill the ex-elf know true fear in his moment of triumph, when, just as he thought the church was under his full and secure control, he saw someone had painted "I know you're Bill" on the wall in green mutant blood, and realized that once again he'd failed his perception check to spot the presence of Jaludin the rogue. Found, meanwhile, that the majority of the group's imprisonment in the dungeons was finally about to come to an end, but only because the Thetas were planning to blow them to bits. We're only comforted by the fact that Bill the ex-elf was only holding off the main force of the Thetas from retaking the church by his haphazard attempts to combine cantrips with a ridiculous pantomime using the severed head of Slothy Rodriguez. Decided the best defense was a good offense by making maximum use of the gender-indeterminate Azure Wizard Batharian's magic missiles and fly spell, Sandy's propensity to slaughter everything in her path, and the rogue's ever-increasing talent at groin stabbing. Learned that in spite of Bill the ex-elf's pleading, Jaludin the rogue is really only in it for himself. We're amused by a totally unrelated side situation where Knight, who had been shot half a century into the future, ended up accidentally killing her own child, a magic deer that stood for all goodness and purity and would restore joy and happiness to the whole forest through its magical fiat power. After causing its accidental death, she only learned it was her son after trying to get back to the past, ending up getting back about a decade too early and hooking up with a minor horned god. Apparently when elves and horned gods mate, they make magic deer babies. Whether or not all of these are doomed to be killed by their own mother 6 decades later is unclear. In any case, Knight made it back to the group the slow way. Cheered when the clerics managed to use divine aid to get into the Church of St. Ignatius. But the leader of the Thetas, El Comandante, decides that this is the last straw, and he's just going to kill every last gringo he sees. El Comandante can be distinguished from the rest of the Thetas because he wears a little beret on top of his Mexican wrestler mask. Held their breath as the clerics fighting for God and the salvation of the world face off for the last time against Bill the ex-elf, fighting for the Daemon Cesrican and his own greed. Both sides plead for the still-hidden Jalaluddin's intervention, but everyone is pretty convinced that at this point, Jalaluddin is just one of these guys who wants to see the world burn, are surprised by how the clerics, a class which until now in the campaign had largely been distinguished as one long comedy of errors and apparently endless suffering, managed to beat the crap out of the elf, which until now had been the ass-kicker class of the campaign. See triumph turn to tragedy when just on the verge of triumph, the Thetas shower Marvin a hail of gunfire, killing him. Watch Akbasha the cleric think that it is his time now to be the chosen one, only to have forgotten about Jalaluddin. He is very promptly reminded by a sharp pain in the back of the head and the dark embrace of unconsciousness. The rest of the team got back together in time to wipe out the Thetas, but by the time they got into the church, found that Marvin and Bill had been ritually sacrificed, and Jalaluddin and the sacred USB cable were gone. Apparently, Jalaluddin had a bidding war between God and Sezrekan for the rights to the cable. God offered Jalaluddin the chance to heal the world. Sezrekan offered him power, money, and women. Obviously, Sezrekan won. Slothy Rodriguez would have been proud. As for Bill, now that Sezrekan has an even more competent servant working for him, he has no immediate need for Bill, who screwed up twice in a row, so Bill will likely be staying inside his soul phylactery for some time to come. But situations do change, so we may not have seen the last of him. Title: DCC Campaign, My Themes Date, April 9th, 2015. I have mixed feelings about the ideas of themes in RPG settings. You don't see me talking about them too often, and more often than not when people do talk about it, it's to sound pretentious. But themes do happen, and they don't necessarily have to be snooty. The Venture Brothers has a theme, failure. The Big Bang Theory has a theme, nerds are laughable, for what it's worth. Good and bad movies, shows, literature, comics, and game settings will have themes. Most of them not put there by someone trying to feel full of himself. Most of the time, the themes in my RPG campaigns are pretty much background stuff. Traveler, for example, has little more than maniacs flying around the galaxy. Albion's is obviously something about adventure, battle, and intrigue during the Rose War. But ironically, perhaps, my most gonzo and easygoing campaign of all, my DCC Last Sun campaign, has the most sophisticated themes. The first and foremost one is decay. Things falling apart, inexorably. By the time of the campaign start, things have been sliding into chaos for a long time already, and as the campaign proceeds, they just get worse. Wherever the PCs go, there's cultures, some that could be called civilizations, many of which are just ruins, but others that appear to be thriving. Yet the underlying clarity of things is that none of these look like they're going to get any better. The best they can is a holding pattern against the great collapse that has afflicted the world of the Last Sun. It is, in other words, a post-apocalyptic sci-fantasy setting, and one that is particularly cynical in its undertone, given its overall goofy gonzo feel. Another theme is the idea of there being no higher powers to help you. The ancients created the world of the Last Sun, but then they vanished. The Dark Ones allegedly ruined it, but no one has seen them either. God is only a machine that has been driven insane by the emergency and is largely irrational about when he gives divine aid and when he shows disapproval. The daemons are all rebellious AIs that escaped God's control and are themselves either insane, evil, totally selfish, or utterly uncaring. No one mightier than the PCs and a few well-intentioned NPCs are actually out there that would either care or be capable of setting the world right again, with the god of the setting being essentially a demiurge to totally distant architects. The setting itself has the quality of a Gnostic dream, pushed on by the wacky surrealism of the setting. The Last Sun is a world built around the very last start of the dying universe, as an attempt to escape the end of all reality. The world is a bit like a bardo, a dream state from Tibetan Buddhism. You could meet almost anything there. Anything that ever existed might still be around in the world of the Last Sun. There's lots of old weapons, including guns and laser guns, and atom bombs and spaceships, and old knowledge, including old magic items and spells, but no one seems really able to make anything truly new. It's like a dream before dying. Even the core races have their own thematic ways of dealing with this decay. For humans, it's fear. Of the four core races, they're the closest to extinction, being overrun by more powerful creatures and the environment itself, mutating them into something not human. What humans have shown up in the campaign are usually acting out of fear. Elves are in denial. They were the high-tech super-civilization before the emergency. Most of the surviving elf cultures weathered what they imagined to be the worst of it in the snug safety of their domes, but disconnected from the rest of the world and cut off from the need to do anything useful. Their society has decayed most of all. There's the hipster elves and the smug elves and the emo elves, but it seems like any breed of elf that actually did anything has died out. They keep living their petty lives, but have become useless, even to save themselves. Dwarves are all about anger, driven away from their homes in the deep underground, where they maintained the great world machines for the ancients. They seem doomed to hopeless crusades to retake everything they've lost, even though it's impossible. Their entire society is based on complaints and resentment. They are good at playing defense, but whenever they go on the offensive, they get slaughtered. For halflings, it's a kind of collaboration. Whatever they once were, now they've become vicious, bloodthirsty barbarian cannibals, who have given up the semblance of being anything other than animals. They are thriving in numbers, the only one of the four traditional core races that are, but only because they've completely given up on trying to fight decay and have become active agents in accelerating it. They live, but their culture is extinct, replaced with a feral savagery. The real question of the campaign is whether the PCs, from their individual heroism, will ultimately find a way to triumph over this decay, to set the world right somehow, and what form that will take. So I wrote all this here because sooner or later, I'm going to write a setting book about the world of the last sun. That's almost inevitable. But when I do, it probably won't say any of this stuff explicitly. Instead, it will be full of stuff about laser penguins and sloth drug lords and talking ape, civilizations and laser guns and all the other weird gonzo places and things of the world. But I figure that this look at the underpinnings of the campaign should be said somewhere, for the sake of those who might be interested in looking at the underpinnings of things. Because just like themes don't necessarily have to be pretentious, gonzo RPG campaigns don't necessarily have to be dumb. Title: DCC Campaign Update. Orange Shaman Psychic Hotline. Date: April 18, 2015. In this week's DCC game, the PCs were given the generous offer by the Azure Order that the next time there was a situation that required putting one's very life in peril for some minor good and no guarantee of material compensation, the PCs would be the first in line. Chuckled at the irony that Rickandra would be buried as a woman, as she had always wanted. Were determined to actually go find Cesrican, kick the living shit out of him, and take back the sacred USB cable. Were a little disheartened to learn that Cesrican's tower isn't even on this dimension. Were further disheartened when they realized that in the world of the last sun, the Azure Order are pretty much as great as it gets in terms of good aligned, powerful, and reliable allies. There literally doesn't seem to be anyone else available that fits all three categories. Went to buy some blowguns, but not to hunt the deadly, spindly killerfish. Bored Sandy, the bikini chainmail barbarian, enough that she decided to go off and get herself totally wasted drunk and beat the crap out of a bunch of tough guy mutants. Or as she calls it, a short vacation. Were presented with one of those aforementioned generous offers by the Azure Order, but finding themselves short-staffed, decided they needed some cannon fodder, new recruits. So they picked up a superannuated street urchin who was set loose in the forest by slavers after he proved too ugly to be purchased, an orange mutant apprentice shaman with psychic powers, and an assistant reanimator. It wasn't quite clear just what a reanimator does, but he came with a brain in a jar. Were sent south to discover the cause of increased aggression by the purple mutant barbarians and resolve the mystery of what appear to be unprovoked and vicious attacks on local mutants by strange, twisted treants. When told they had to go south, several party members responded at once with the quip that this party has been going south for quite some time now. Were surprised to encounter a hideous creature in the forest, somewhat resembling a gray alien, only fairly obese and wearing an expensive yet slightly skanky dress and a little tiara. Were even more surprised when she introduced herself as Queen Priscilla, of the Grey Lands and said she was looking for Bill the Elf. They were surprised, I note, because none of the player characters presently alive and in attendance this session had actually been around back when Queen Priscilla last appeared. Found that Queen Priscilla was highly distraught at the news that Bill the Elf died, then came back, then died again, and now appears to be indisposed. Discovered that Queen Priscilla had hoped that Bill the Elf would help her reconquer her kingdom, as she had apparently been overthrown and exiled from her home dimension by some green asshole, who they deduced was in fact the game controller of the Jade dimension that had managed to flee from the PCs in that other dimension just before the PCs totally ruined it. Apparently, he managed to set himself up nicely in the Grey dimension, not that it was hard since, apparently, the entirety of Queen Priscilla's people were desperate to see her overthrown. To visualize Priscilla, imagine a cross between this and this, decide to take Priscilla with them, in the hopes of restoring her to her birthright of tyranny over the Grey people, so that in exchange she will provide them an interdimensional army to move against Sezrekan. Start to think, after about 30 straight minutes of Priscilla talking non-stop about what a slag Tiffany is, and how Brad is totally into her and not Tiffany. But Tiffany lied about Priscilla having herpes so she could get him to sleep with her instead, because she's a total slut that they've made a terrible, terrible mistake. Decide it's time to use the silence spell, which gives them about 6 melee rounds of peace and quiet, only to have Priscilla start all over again. They then decide that it's time for Sandy to use her silence spell, which involves Sandy using a club to beat Priscilla into unconsciousness. Spend much of the night by the campfire arguing over the sound of Priscilla's loud snoring about whether an interdimensional army would really be worth another 24 hours, much less possibly weeks with Priscilla. The cleric Akbasha, filled with thirst for vengeance against Sezrekan, believes it is. The rest of the party thinks it isn't, except for the ex-street waif that thinks he might have a shot with Priscilla, causing everyone to question his eyesight or his sanity. Watch as the psychic orange mutant apprentice, Shaman, claims to Sandy that he can effectively read fortunes with his divination bones. Sandy decides to put it to the test by asking him to make a prediction. If he's right, she'll give him a shiny gold piece. If he's wrong, she'll break something in his body. Are all surprised at the orange mutant's luck, or perhaps real ability, when he predicts rain, and it does in fact start to drizzle a little the next day. Proceed to the south, killing a few hapless kobolds and making a point of keeping Priscilla sedated by periodic clubbings. Watch as a still, skeptical Sandy challenges the orange mutant a second night, with the same wager. He predicts that the party will soon have a detour through some ruins, run into a group of green mutant barbarian warriors who are at war with the hyper-aggressive purple mutants. Have to do a bit of explaining at the presence of a non-barbarian purple mutant Shul the Rogue among them, but eventually convince the green mutants that they're here to deal with the purple mutants, and that they should be taken to the green mutant village. Learn that the purple mutant barbarians have always been assholes, but have become completely warlike after converting to the worship of something called the Necro-Treant. Are amused as Shul the Rogue, realizing that he might run into some serious trouble in a village full of people who despise purple mutants, tries to use his disguise skill and Queen Priscilla's makeup kit to hide his racial identity. Rather than ending up looking like a non-purple mutant, he manages to end up looking like something along the lines of a purple mutant circus, clown, prostitute. Meet the green mutant chief and try to convince him that all the other mutant tribes in the region must join forces against the purple mutants, the Necro-Treant, and his army of zombie treants. The orange mutant shaman decides to try his luck by suggesting they do the meeting in the ruins, and turns out to have once again shown his amazing psychic skills, luck by the response that indicates that there are indeed ruins, albeit forbidden ones, nearby. Note that Sandy, immediately after paying the orange mutant yet another shiny gold piece, is especially interested in going to ruins that are forbidden, since there's likely to be stuff to kill and or loot there, and her urge to break people has not been fulfilled in quite some time. Decide to head off to the ruins, leaving Priscilla behind at the green mutant village in the spare time they have while they wait for the great council of mutant chiefs. That will take place in the sacred grove. Find that the forbidden ruins are full of deadly, spindly killer beetles. Force the creepy ex-street waif to poke the beetle nest with his 10-foot pole until they all rush him. Then wait until the orphan is dead before cutting the beetles to pieces. Generally agree that having gotten rid of the pervy street waif and having gained a 6-pack of magic potions and 25,000 platinum pieces was a very good trade-off. Camp out near the ruins, where Sandy again engages in some prophecy fun time with the orange shaman, having quickly turned from being an angry skeptic to a true believer in the shaman's psychic hotline skills. He makes the unlikely prediction that Sandy, by far the best fighter of the party, will do poorly in battle and have her abilities fall into doubt. Get attacked that night by a positively terrifying zombie treant. Get themselves into a tight spot when the rogues find their backstabs do nothing. The cleric fails his attempt at divine aid, and Sandy incredibly keeps missing her attack rolls. Start to wonder whether the orange shaman's predictions are a prophecy or a kind of curse. Not that he will comment in mid-battle, as he's busy faking a heart attack and playing dead in the desperate hope the treant won't tear him to pieces. Are only saved at the last minute by a Hail Mary, pardon the pun, second divine aid attempt, on the part of the cleric, where he manages to call down the lightning on the zombie treant. Start to realize that to the cleric, his new big bag of platinum pieces are really little more than get out of divine disapproval tokens. Return to the green mutant village only to find that it's been raided by the purple mutants, that 2 of the chief's daughters have been kidnapped to be used as sacrifices to the necro treant, and that Queen Priscilla has been taken as well. Decide they'll have to try to rescue the chief's daughters, even if that means they'll probably have to rescue Priscilla as well. Want to go to the great gathering of the chiefs first, and convince the green mutant chief to come with them after all. D initially decided to forget the whole thing, after being told of something the orange mutant psychic had said in passing. Get to the sacred grove, only to find that the chiefs of all the other mutant tribes have been slaughtered by a force of purple mutants and zombie treants, one unit of which end up encountering the party and attacking. Once again find themselves in a very tight spot, especially after the cowardly green mutant chief runs away rather than fight it out. But this time the orange mutant shaman manages to distract the treant by drinking a potion of animal control and summoning a large flock of woodpeckers to harass it. Suddenly the battle has become, for the zombie treant, a scene out of a Hitchcock movie. Manage to destroy the treant and kill most of the purple mutants, except a couple that they keep to interrogate with extreme prejudice, but are saddened by the tragic death by spear blow of the orange mutant psychic, just as the tide of battle was turning. Can't help but note that the psychic sure didn't see that one coming. RPG Pundit. Title: DCC Campaign Update, Birth of the Cyber Redneck. Date: May 16, 2015. In this adventure, the PCs were caught up in the midst of the cleric Akbasha falling deeper and deeper into the rabbit hole of his implausible revenge fantasy against Cesrican. The new warrior in the party, Byfeld, turning out to be pretty much based on this guy. Discussing whether someone could forest walk through a necrotreant, and deciding to err on the side of caution. A minor incident when the warrior redneck claims that all purple mutants look alike. A series of other George W. Bushisms from said redneck warrior. Coming to the realization that Shul, the party's rogue, is a really terrible liar, as in, really bad at it. Encountering the dreaded necrotreant, and learning that among his various statements of religious policy, he has declared hats an abomination. Meeting the purple mutant chief, who is desperate to prove that he's still totally relevant, and has not at all been completely marginalized into obscurity by the necrotreant and his religious cult of shaman wizards. Bush. Related paranoia. Not as in George W., but as in literal bushes. It's scary to try to sneak up on the necrotreant in the middle of a forest when the dude can apparently turn any foliage into a horrific vegetable, undead monstrosity. A near interminable, rambling, and pointless anecdote from the king of Elfland, who is very clearly the Grandpa Simpson of Damon. Patrons, realizing that to the necrotreant, it's not just hats, pretty much everything is an abomination. Finding that the whole of the purple mutant tribe is just in denial. Caught up in their best chance ever to destroy their hated enemies, the smug elves of the Silver Dome, they've managed to convince themselves that when the necrotreant says that mutants are an abomination, He obviously must mean all those other mutants, not them. Surely this won't come back to bite them in the ass. To be fair, there's few things worse than a smug elf. Realizing that for the moment it's probably better to join them rather than try to beat them, though. Joining them might mean having to eat a delicious-looking stew made out of green mutant princesses. Reluctantly joining the cause of the Necrotreant in exchange for Queen Priscilla, of the Grey people being liberated rather than added to the stew, and immediately regretting it, because now they have to put up with Queen Priscilla again. Queen Priscilla, on the other hand, is very pleased with the death of her fellow princesses, since she was pretty sure they were all skanks who probably had STDs, discovering new boundaries to just how badass Sandy the Bikini chainmail barbarian is, when she manages to be terrifyingly threatening while armed with nothing more than a sharpened carrot, figuring out that casting sleep while floating 60 feet in the air might not be such a good idea if you misfire and end up dozing off in mid-flight and plummeting to your near-to-death. The clear confirmation that the purple mutant chief is definitely no longer in any way relevant. Finding that the purple mutants like to worship hard, sacrifice hard, and then party hard, with a post-to-cannibalism rave dance. It's pretty much like that with all barbarians, as the party's willingness to party is pretty evenly split along barbarian, civilized lines, waking up the next morning with a variety of levels of hangover, the best case being very mild, the worst cases being redneck warrior who got into a drunken knife fight, and Queen Priscilla who accidentally killed a purple mutant during some heavy necking when she forgot that she was poisonous to humanoids. Fortunately, Shul the Rogue might be a really bad liar, but he is a fully trained former grave digger. Getting that Queen Priscilla may be the most annoying entity in the multiverse, when she can manage to get Akbasha, the normally placid party cleric, to drown her in a bucket of water, though he was still nice enough to give her a potion of water breathing first. Predictably, Queen Priscilla thinks Akbasha is the perviest cleric ever, and that he's obviously doing it because he fancies her. An assessment of their present choices, Night the Elf is fighting a one-woman guerrilla war against the Necrotreant, while everyone else in the party has decided to join him in his assault on the Silver Dome. No one is sure if either is really a good idea. Deciding to get the heck out of Dodge, or rather, of the purple mutant town of Cordalin, while the getting is good, but pausing briefly so Redneck Warrior can pick up some wild carrots to make up for the one he lost in the drunken knife fight. Later deciding to tie Queen Priscilla to a tree and abandon her in the woods, while going to see how the purple mutant smug elf battle royale goes down, watching as the elven lightning gun defenses cause a near immediate rout among the panicky purple mutants. But things get interesting when the Necrotreant apparently sacrifices all of his undead treants to drive roots up against the foundations of the dome, cracking it open, continuing to watch from the security of a hiding place as the purple mutants rally, only to flee again when their shamans accidentally botch their choking cloud spell and cause a lethal poison-to gas attack on their own ranks. Things get worse when the elves release their hunter-killer droids, but the Necrotreant still has some tricks up his sleeve as he entangles them in fungal vines until the robots are crushed, finally deciding to join the fray, or at least try to make a dash and grab for some quick loot when they see the purple mutant elite warriors sneaking their way toward the crack in the dome while carrying a mysterious and elaborate box that just screams secret weapon. Managing to get through the crack under a spell of darkness only to get pinned down under a hail of blaster fire from elven and android troops, attempting to hold against the barrage, all except Knight, who flies off to keep an eye on the Necrotreant, and Byfeld, the redneck warrior, who tries to hide inside the secret weapon box, even though it's clearly not large enough for him to fit in. Discovering that the secret weapon box is filled with hideous, writhing fungal undead seeds. Not sure what else to do, and seeing his teammates on the verge of getting slaughtered, Redneck Warrior decides to do what he does best and smash the living shit out of the weird seed pods, observing the shattering of the Necrotreant's dreams of purity as the seeds he planned to germinate in an explosion of the Silver Dome's power sphere, an explosion that would have utterly annihilated all life within a radius of 1,000 miles, to create a new race of mutant necrotreants are destroyed by a human yokel with an oversized mace, running like hell from the super-efficient smug elves and their android soldiers, abandoning the critically injured redneck warrior to his fate. An act of blatant opportunism. Night the elf takes advantage of the necrotreant's distracted grief to hit him with every spell he's got. As it turns out, the King of Elfland's modified haste spell provides Night with almost enough power to kill the already wounded necrotreant. Fortunately for Night, good old-fashioned fire manages to finish the job before the necrotreant can retaliate with his death ray. Groaning as the King of Elfland, who just maybe, is not quite as senile as he lets on, cannot resist the pun of saying that the necrotreant's bark was worse than his bite. A denouement, as Byfeld the redneck warrior wakes up in the middle of the tangled forest, finding that instead of being elf food, he's been set loose in the forest and his horrific laser injuries repaired in the form of a cybernetic lower body, and possibly a mind-controlling brain implant. Title: DCC Campaign Update. Genocide, the Easy Way date, May 28, 2015. So in this week's adventure we found Night the elf trying to bond to a second patron, having gotten sick of the King of Elfland's senile crap. By sheer random chance, coming up with the King of Elfland again when rolling for a random patron 5% chance, the local village blacksmith showing a lack of metallurgy knowledge by failing to identify Electrum, deciding it was a brand new metal, and calling it smithium in his own honor. Said blacksmith trying to subtly generate a market for his new metal by creating and showing off smithium jewelry. Shul the rogue, discovering an azure wizard, secretly engaging in forbidden service to the Lord of all flesh. The village smith correctly identifying the cyborg redneck's new lower body as a titanium dolomite composite, in spite of his inability to recognize Electrum. The smith's second line of jewelry, of mixed smithium and platinum, or as he calls it, smithpleum. The shocking abduction of Night by what appear to be dwarven ninjas riding a cyborg dragon. Dwarf ninjas, yes. That Feld son of Feldstein, the dwarf who had absconded with the huge treasure hoard the PCs had stolen from Tiamat's corpse, has returned. And he has a band of half-cybernetic dwarven ninja followers and cyber-dragon allies. When he goes to take back the lost dwarven machine holds, he's going to do it the smart way. Unfortunately, he has to kill the new Dragon King, Marduk. First, because Marduk wants him, and as it turns out the PC's dead for having slain Tiamat. Night being held captive, along with the ex-Azure wizard turned Lord of Flesh cultist. Feld making the mistake of undoing the wizard's gag, allowing him to call on the Lord of Flesh for sexy time. The rest of the PCs heading north in search of something to kill and loot. Said PCs running into giant weasels, but it was they who ripped the weasel's flesh. Substitute Han Solo for Quillian the Rogue, and you get the idea. Night recovering from her degenerate stupor to find herself in a Princess Leia Jabba situation with the leader Cyberdragon, and learning from him that they are on one of the great floating islands far above the Earth, in the Cyberdragon HQ known as Area 51. Night learning that the dragons plan to attack the damaged Silver Dome, while the smug elves are still recovering from the attack of the necrotreant, steal the dome's power sphere and use it to blow Marduk to smithereens. They Cyberdragons are in revolt against Marduk because they will have no leader, except the Cyberdragon leader, of course. But the Cyberdragon leader assures her that's different. That also, the Cyberdragons use their cybernetics to communicate in a semi-hive mind. Or as they put it, we are Legion, united by our superior social media, to which the dwarves simply reply, and we are dwarves. The rest of the PCs down below, spotting one of the Cyberdragon scouts, which takes an interest in the cyber redneck's clearly smug elven cybernetics. That when said scout kidnaps the cyber redneck, the rest of the PCs try to hop on and ride the dragon. That unfortunately, while the two rogues have no trouble jumping on, Akbasha the cleric falls flat on his face, and Sandy the bikini chainmail barbarian gets knocked off the first time the dragon swerves. The cleric managing to use divine aid effectively to teleport into Area 51 at the same time as the Cyberdragon scout does. Night causing the worst game of broken telephone ever when she sends a vague message that leads both sides to mistakenly believe that Bill the Elf, rather than the much less menacing Knight the Elf, is in the area. Both sides hate Bill and assume he's aiding the other side. The matter clearing up, however, just as Knight invokes the King of Elfland to teleport her away, before suffering the wrath of the cyber dragons, cybernetic ninja dwarves, and her fellow PCs. The rest of the PCs trying to negotiate with Feld based on their collective hatred of Bill the Elf. The cyber redneck finding out that his cybernetics come with a mind control chip, implant that could potentially turn him into a mindless drone of the smug elves. Shul and Quillian, the two rogues, happily accepting the cyber dragon's offer of being given free, totally awesome cyber implants themselves, in spite of only just hearing just how easily the whole thing could, and almost certainly is, a trick to make them drones. That most of Feld's dwarves had taken up the offer already, leading the other PCs to realize that the cyber dragons are just using Feld, that unfortunately for Knight, the King of Elfland appears to have screwed up as usual, and set her several hundred years into the past, when the Azure Tower is just being built, that the future paranoia of the Azure Order about not sharing their spells and items with anyone outside their group may have inadvertently been caused by Knight's ill-chosen words. Knight giving the early Azure wizards a simple message to send to Tiamat, and thus accidentally changing the entire timeline as Tiamat ends up wiping out every last cyber dragon in reaction to this message. Knight's player gets 4 XP for easily accomplished genocide, and most of what the PCs just went through in this session didn't actually ever happen now. Knight gets back to the present, and the PCs find themselves back in the village, all with vague memories about what had been happening, and then ended up never happening at all. Meanwhile, Knight has lost her armor, her wizard's staff, and most of her items as a result of her shenanigans, as they are lost somewhere in the temporal paradox. She also used massive spellburn to get through it all, and only now does the King of Elfland tell her that she cannot regain any of her spellburned attributes until she obtains for him a violet lotus shrubbery. Welcome to massive attribute penalties, Knight. Akbasha the cleric is particularly peeved at the sudden change of timeline, as he had been just on the verge of hammering out a PC cyber dragon dwarf ninja alliance that would have them all work together to slay Marduk and then go after Sezrekan, his one burning obsession lately, only to have timey-wimey shit ruin it all for him. The King of Elfland is a little bit like Doctor Who if Time Lords got Alzheimer's. Knight reasoning that, at least, surely her temporal intervention has made things better in the present, but the King of Elfland assures her that no, in fact she made things much worse, though he doesn't explain how. The PC's willing to forgive Knight and help her in her quest for the shrubbery, and realizing that the violet lotus is a highly hallucinogenic substance, which may in fact explain a lot about the King of Elfland. Perhaps such a shrubbery might be found in the city of High Bay. So off they go en route to visit the city of junkies. The line when we get to High Bay will all be riding the dragon, the PCs, en route through the tangled wood toward the coast, discovering that apparently Smithpleum jewelry is catching on, with forest creatures refusing to believe the PCs that it's just Electrum, and claiming that something called the Fashion Bear has endorsed it. This was the first image that came up when I googled Fashion Bear. I was thinking more along the lines of an actual bear, but now I might just have to make this guy into an NPC for this campaign. The gang being accosted in the deeper part of the forest by a pair of shady-looking mobster unicorns, who demand magic items in exchange for being allowed to pass through their forest unmolested. Knight starting a fight, wherein the unicorns subject the PCs to blasts of rainbow power, bitch. Not to mention being viciously gored, but a well-placed force ball injures. And then Shul the rogue's dagger kills one unicorn and the other teleports away. That this was not the end of it, however, as the surviving unicorn comes back to avenge his brother, accompanied by his friend, a kung fu-trained wuxia cow named Hooves of Steel. The cyber redneck being viciously beaten to death by a wuxia cow, and Shul, the rogue, being nearly killed via unicorn horn-based violence. Before Sandy the barbarian, annoyed at her sleep being interrupted 2 nights in a row, murders the unicorn by throwing her mace at it, and the kung fu cow by throwing her dining fork at it. That's it for today. Next session, The trip to High Bay will no doubt continue, probably accompanied by more eccentric forest, creature violence. Title: DCC Campaign Archive. The Bean Thing from the Furry Bay. Date: June 12, 2015. The PCs started this week's DCC session mourning the death of the cyber redneck, and by mourning I mean looting the corpse. Shortly thereafter, they witnessed the return of Batharian, the gender-indeterminate wizard, and immediately after that the arrival of 3 new zero-level hero noobs. It was noted a strange curiosity that in this world, cannon fodder always came in groups of 3. An explanation was offered that it may have something to do with the 3 fates. After that, the PCs got acquainted with Nigel, the religious fantastic. Apparently, religious fantastics are a movement from a distant part of the world that are a kind of combination between devout followers of God and soccer hooligans, sharing the good news of the religious life and viciously clubbing anyone who doesn't listen. Got a bit lost in the deepest recesses of the tangled wood, while still on a meandering route to High Bay. Apparently, as one of their new arrivals to the party proved, professional dung gatherers are not particularly qualified by their career to serve as wilderness guides. Nevertheless, reached the River of Gems, which proved rather disappointing, as it had long since been mined dry of any gems. Recalled that the reason they were going to High Bay, also known as the City of Stoners, was that night had to obtain a violet lotus, shrubbery for the King of Elfland, without which she could never recover the ridiculous amount of spellburn she'd spent on agility. She was effectively derped up, bumping into trees almost constantly as they traveled. Found that even Knight's hearing had apparently been gimped, as she'd completely failed to hear the arrival of an extremely elderly dwarf knight, who had apparently been on a Geese-induced for these last 200 years of his life. Watched as the elderly dwarf, with what seemed to be his dying breath, bequeathed his bag of magic beans to Knight, to be planted at the shores of the Furry Bay, and with strict instructions that they be used for good and not for self-serving purposes in spite of the great power these beans were said to grant. Also watched as the elderly dwarf seemed to not quite be dead yet for quite some time, his lingering ruining what would otherwise have been an intensely dramatic final moment. Likewise watched as the dwarf cursed himself for giving away the extremely powerful beans not to be misused to the first party member he met, rather than to the azure wizard who would be far more likely not to misuse them. Finally nodded off after concluding that the elderly dwarf wasn't likely to actually die quite, yet only to wake the next morning to find nothing left of him but dust and his armor. Discovered, and proceeded to mostly ignore, the fact that the detect magic spell registered the beans as not being from this plane. Realized that the second sight spell, cast by clerics through the somatic component of shaking their tablet while asking a question, was really just a magic 8-ball app. Managed to get themselves ambushed by a gang of centaur slavers with Australian accents, all of whom were named Bruce. Were to be taken to be sold as slaves to Lord Dread of Castle Dread, who everyone, even the centaurs, agree is a total asshole. Bided their time for the right moment to try to get free, which came along the next day when the centaurs got into a fight with a passing patrol of mutants from the town of Fox, which is routinely mispronounced, much to its inhabitants' chagrin. Ran into some trouble with their escape attempt when the centaurs scared off the mutant militiamen a lot faster than anticipated, and most of the PCs hadn't even managed to get free of their bonds yet. Saw Knight the elf make the ultimately extremely unfortunate decision of eating all the magic beans, in the hope that they would grant her immense cosmic power. The beans were evil. Watch Sandy and Batharian get the living crap kicked out of them by the centaurs, while Shul surrendered to them to avoid a similar beating. However, Akbasha the cleric saved the day by a very creative use of his holy sanctuary spell. Saw Knight fly after the fleeing centaurs while the rest of the party was still freeing itself. They did not see how when Knight started to cast spells against the centaurs, she immediately started to mutate into a horrific derpy fungus thing and fly off, no longer in control of her own body. Decided to track the centaurs first, and try finding Knight later, not being aware of her horrific bean-related metamorphosis. Plotted a careful nighttime assault on the centaurs, which immediately turned into a string of fumble and spell misfire-related disasters. Suddenly Sandy couldn't manage to hit the broadside of a barn, and Shul the Rogue fell flat on his face in some centaur droppings rather than skillfully backstab the person he was supposed to backstab. Bytharion finally managed to save the day with his trademark gender-changing magic missiles, decided to rest and recover from their fairly serious wounds that night, and put off searching for Night until the morning. After all, how much difference could one more day make, right? Woke up the next morning to find a 200-story tall, horrific, derpy fungus thing emerging from the furry bay. Decided it was time to use God to call up the Azure Wizards, since this was frankly beyond them. Went with the entire High Council of the Azure Wizards to High Bay, where they found a mix of panic and business as usual, as about half of the population were apparently convinced that the colossal void-infected monstrosity that was slowly shambling toward their city was probably just a drug-induced hallucination. Headed to the city offices, except for Shul, who stopped off at the market to purchase a violet lotus shrubbery. Met once again with Chief City Officer Swanley, who was pretty blasé about the latest existential threat to his city, in spite of, or perhaps because of, his reputation for being the only stone-cold sober man in the whole town. He may just be the DCC version of this guy. Learned to their dismay that their friend Bolto the conversation robot, who had last been seen accepting a bureaucratic position in the city government, was not in town, but had in fact been kidnapped by the orc mercenary chief, Omblarg, on the last occasion that Lord Dread had tried to besiege High Bay. Omblarg had since parted company with Lord Dread and overran and conquered the town of Bad Breath. Decided that the best plan was the one proposed by Leandra of the Azure Order, which would be for the Azure Wizards, including Bytharion, to make a massive group ritual casting to try to petrify the monstrosity, while the others protected the wizards around their circle. Began the ritual and quickly found themselves accosted by a trio of incomprehensible terrors from the void, who could eat magical energy and looked a little bit like transparent ducks covered in tentacles. They were scarier than the description sounds, what with ducks being evil to begin with. Were about to start fighting these creatures, when the derpy fungus kaiju only made things worse by spitting out a toxic mist of hallucinogenic gas, instantly incapacitating half the party, including Sandy, their best fighter. Watched in terror as the evil tentacle ducks man was not meant to know dug their tentacles into Leandra and sucked out her soul. Were further horrified to find that ordinary weapons could not hurt the ducks. Reached the limit of Lovecraftian terror when the derpy fungus kaiju shat out radioactive acid all over the Bay Area, likely ruining property values portside. Saw Akbasha the cleric once more step up to almost save the day, blowing away most of the Cthulhu ducks with a particularly effective turn, Unholy. Snatched victory from the jaws of failure when Shul the Rogue, in an uncharacteristic display of valor, stepped up and managed to kill the last of the Kulu ducks after borrowing the hornet mace from a drugged-out Sandy. Breathed a sigh of relief as the Azure Wizards were then able to launch their spell, turning the derpy fungus kaiju into a gigantic statue, and about a kilometer of the now poisoned bay into solid stone too, prompting City Officer Swanley to note that this will require considerable and expensive infrastructure investment. Sadly, if you haven't guessed by now, the monstrosity was none other than Night, transformed by the Dark Ones, evil beings into a horror, and now quite dead. Although her possession of an amulet of protection from death, though it did not do what she thought it would do, did turn out to allow her to live a relatively comfortable afterlife, instead of having her memories washed away and being subject to an eternity of being poked with pitchforks. The team also lost an erstwhile ally in the form of Leandra, the leader of the Azure Order. Next time, they'll probably be going to rescue Bolt Zero, which should be fun. Title: DCC Campaign Update. Birth of Queen Dread. Date: July 1st, 2015. This week's adventure began in the wreckage of High Bay after the devastating derpy kaiju attack of last session. Leandra, the leader of the Azure Wizards, died in the battle, and the PCs had the sense that it might be time to find new pastures instead of the Azure Tower, unsure if whoever is chosen as her successor would be as friendly to them. The plan emerged to try to figure out a way to stick around High Bay and stake some of the new territory created by the kilometer-long petrification spell. A plot was hatched to possibly build and run some kind of adventurers guild. In the events that followed, the PCs learned that pretty well everyone in High Bay sells drugs. The old woman who sells eggs, the blacksmith, even the city guard all tried to sell them, special brownies. The leatherworker sells LSD on the side. Found that Chief City Officer Swanley is willing to grant them some land if they go rescue Bolt from the Orc Chief Omblarg. Agreed, even though Sandy the bikini, chainmail barbarian felt that Bolt sounds like one of those wuss robots. He just wants a nice conversation. Quickly found their initial Adventurers Guild plans spiraling into a nascent plot to become key players in High Bay's criminal underworld. Started to suspect that staying too long in High Bay might actually be a really bad idea. Realized that, in a town where all drugs and prostitution are completely legal, local crime, lords have to be really creative when it comes to finding stuff to illegally trade in. Stuff like illicit, smuggled war, elephants. Realized they'd actually stumbled into a turf war between two different bands of something called the Bharata Mafia, fighting over control of the elephant, smuggling trade of High Bay. Learned the aforementioned after Akbasha the cleric made a very cool and true type use of the word of command spell on a hapless Fletcher, commanding him with the word confess. Proceeded to accidentally sell out said Fletcher, after having given him assurances they would keep his secret to yet another mafia, this one working for unknown bosses but led by a guy named Shady Ahmed. Made a deal with Ahmed where they would work together to take over the city of High Bay. You know, for the sake of the children. Got in over their heads quickly, while doing no more than healing up, waiting to go rescue Bolt. First, they accidentally cause a mob war. Then they get the impractical and problematic gift of an illegal war elephant. And then High Bay's enormous hippie community finds out that Akbasha the cleric has a magic staff that makes you trip balls. Wake up to a mob of 1,000 dirty hippies at the entrance to their tavern, much to the chagrin of the highly eccentric innkeeper. Oh God, it's these assholes again. Decide to harness the hippies to get free lumber for their building plans, charging a beam of wood as the price for a ticket to get to have a religious experience with the Primo staff. Discover that their scheme has led to a crime. Wave of hippie stick to APS and hippie break to inns all through the city, which gets them in serious trouble with Chief City Officer Swanley. Decide to take the hippies with them as an army to oppose Omblarg's orcish horde and liberate the town of Bad Breath. Of course, their army is nearly without weapons, food, sometimes shirts or shoes, and entirely bereft of common sense, counting that with marching while signing we shall overcome they'll get what is meant to be. Watch as their hippie army starts to drop like flies en route, still days from the nearest orc, from desertion, starvation, boredom, distraction, getting lost or eaten in the forest, or the creation of drumming circles. Struck an evil deal with the evil Lord Dread, selling out their hippies into serfdom in exchange for safe passage and the possibility that Dread might join Akbasha the cleric's crusade against Cesra Khan. Got a hint that being an evil overlord is not an easy job. Got to hear Lord Dread tell Akbasha that we're not so different, you and I. Arranged a potentially lucrative side deal with Dread to sell him war elephants. Posed as criminal war elephant salesman to get inside Bad Breath and win the trust of the orcs. Were feted with a feast of dog meat, followed by the promise of brown mutant sex slaves. Heroically left the sex slaves unmolested, except for Sandy, who made two of the male slaves make out with each other. Find that their carefully crafted plan to sneakily rescue Bolto and assassinate the orcish chief falls to pieces when they forget that Bolto is totally incapable of modulating the volume of his voice. Find themselves in the unfortunate situation of facing off against 300+ orcs all at once. Watch Sandy turn into a killing machine yet again. Cheered as Shul the rogue gets to the war elephant with the plan to set it loose against the orcs. Groan as it becomes obvious that Shul has no idea whatsoever how to actually get the elephant to charge at the orcs. Confront Chief Omblarg and his champions. See Sandy outdo herself as she enters a battle rage and does 50 horsepowers in one hit against the chief, blowing his head open like a watermelon. Hear the sound of at least 100 orcs shitting themselves simultaneously. Witness Sandy becoming the new chief, as by orcish law whoever kills the chief becomes the chief. Think Sandy is clearly enjoying her new status a little too much. Note that just after your former chief was brutally murdered by a lance throw from a barbarian warrior, woman is a really stupid time for an orc sub-chief to talk about someone throwing like a girl. Make a sudden change of plans now instead of handing bad breath over to Lord Dread and his approaching cavalry. The new plan is to ambush Dread, murder him, and have Sandy take over the whole region. Set up a fire trap for Dread's horsemen, and then butcher Lord Dread first with a well-placed backstab by Shula Rogue, then by Sandy charging in with the war elephant and impaling Dread on an orcish long spear. Observe that Sandy seems to have taken orcish law to heart, as she now declares herself to be not just the new orc chief, but also the new Lady Dread. Most of Dread's horsemen got away, presumably to hunker down in Castle Dread. The plan is now to march the orcish army there and lay siege to the castle so Sandy can complete her transformation from barbarian warrior to barbarian queen. This is pretty much what every Castle Dread ever looks like. I found it on the first page of a Google image search for Castle Dread. Meanwhile, the poor high bay hippies aren't going to get any breaks, as Sandy, drunk with power, makes it clear that she plans to carry through with Dread's original scheme of condemning them to a life of serfdom, tilling the fields for her in bad breath. RPG Pundit. Currently smoking Italian Red Bark plus Image Latakia. Title, DCC Campaign Archive. The campaign enters the urine drinking stage. Date, July 9, 2015. This adventure was relatively low on action. There was only one fight, and it was quite short, but there were several occasions where the PCs were given XP for overcoming challenges without actually fighting. In this session, the PCs briefly became the new Queen Dreads, formerly Sandy the Barbarian's small council. Akbasha the Cleric became her queen's hand, eventually with a literal severed hand pinned to his armor. Acted as diplomats to negotiate the surrender of Castle Dread, being held by Lord Dread's former henchmen. The henchmen were ordered by Sandy to surrender to her and swear fealty, or she would personally kill every last one of them with a wooden spoon. Were unwisely told to fuck off by the former Lord Dread's officers, who later sent a mostly incompetent assassin after Sandy, promptly got said assassin to snitch, and later tied him to the war. Elephants' tusks when they marched forward to besiege the castle, cooked up a plan whereby the common soldiers of the castle were given a chance to save their own hides by murdering their commanders and opening the gates for Sandy. They did so. Noted that Dread's army was a impressively inclusive group of mutants of all colors, united only by their ability to tolerate Dread's cartoonish supervillainy. Found the late Lord Dread's collection of ancient pornography, not so cleverly disguised as an ordinary library beneath false book. Slips of what looked like serious works were countless volumes of Bazonga's Monthly, Nipples Showcase, and other such works. Realized that the late Lord Dread was a sad, shame-ridden, lonely man. Saw that when Tranus the Wizard tried to obtain a patron, it was yet again the King of Elfland who answered the call. After hearing a long diatribe about how much 1 GP used to get you, Tranus decided to keep shopping for a different patron. Did hear some hint from the King of Elfland that some elves somewhere were doing something that might endanger the whole world, but he couldn't remember what. Helped design a new banner for Sandy's new empire, they ultimately decided. On the former militaristic Black Eagle of Lord Dread, mounted on Sandy's war elephant, wielding a two-handed sword in one claw, an orcish long spear in the other, and drenched the blood of enemies. Now that's badass heraldry. Started the journey to take Bolt Zero the robot back to High Bay as usual. Bolt Zero injected a great deal of what he considered interesting conversation into the trip. Also decided to take Lord Dread's codpiece with them, as absolute proof of his demise. Were feted on the streets of High Bay on their arrival, at the news that Lord Dread was slain, and the slightly less accurate news that now one of the good guys is in charge. High Bay's chief officer realized that this might not be quite so accurate. When the PCs had to convey Sandy's demands, that she would not raise their city to the ground so long as they provided a regular tribute of hippies for her to work to death on her new lands. Started to realize the extent to which their friend Shady Ahmed was involved in the criminal underworld of High Bay, and how quickly their plan to set up a little business for themselves was slipping out of their control. had to deal with the High Council of the city wanting to obtain the Primo staff for themselves. Received a partial but detailed list from Bolt Zero of the known major daemon patrons in the world, apart from those they were already familiar with. The list of names included things like the Vicious Rabbit, the Left Nostril of Vecna, and Alan Moore. Watched as Tranus decided, of all the long list he obtained, to try to call on Lariel the Heretic for his patron, which the rest of the party very quickly felt was a terrible mistake. Discovered that Lariel the Heretic is apparently the patron sponsor of the religious Fantastics, and although a daemon program that rebelled against God. After the latter's insanity, like all the other daemons, she claims, or maybe even believes that she is the spokesperson for God's will in the world now. And apparently God's will is to viciously beat anyone who doesn't accept his love and grace. Noted how Tranus the wizard was baptized in steel, being branded with a metal cross on his forehead, alignment shifted to lawful, and renamed Nigel. Apparently all the religious Fantastics are in fact named Nigel. We're pleased to hear that Lariel is all for destroying Cesarcan and regaining the sacred USB cable, but not so pleased to note that rather than rebooting God, her plan is to hold the cable for safekeeping until God's plan is fulfilled. Accidentally caused yet another wave of social unrest as Nigel and Nigel started spreading the good word of God's love by beating the living crap out of every hippie they can find. Failed to impress Chief City Officer Swanley, who made his feelings clear. This city is already full of drugs. The last thing it needs is religion. After seeing the Nigels force a group of old women to do a na-na-na-na chant and do the wave for the glorification of God, on threat of vicious beating, Akbasha starts to see the downside of the religious Fantastics. Not so much, however, that he won't use them against Cesarcan. Leave High by ship, planning to go to the homeland of the religious Fantastics, leaving one of the Nigels, the mobsters, the even higher council, Bolt Zero and City Chief Swanley behind. God knows what it'll look like when they get back, but at least they've kept their spotless record of leaving every single place they visit looking much shittier than when they arrived. Soon realize that the legless insane ship captain doesn't actually know what he's doing. Promptly enter the urine drinking stage of the voyage. Realize that the sea captain was in fact specifically hired by Chief City Officer Swanley with the intention of getting rid of them. Rehire the captain with a bag of gold, a bottle of urine, and some of Lord Dread's porn to actually get them to the town of Mancatcher, headquarters of the religious Fantastics. Realize after another week at sea that the captain doesn't actually know how to get to Mancatcher or anywhere else. His usual course is to sail around the island of the Turtle Men until everyone gets dizzy, and then head back home, but they've gone so far out now that he can't find that either. Finally hit land, with the captain thinking they've made it back to High Bay, but in fact they've ended up in the southern Ape-Man kingdoms, an entire continent away from either where they came from or where they were trying to go. Run into some ape-men, but recall what their friend Dr. Theobald had said about the ape-men being slavers. When one of them says, "Get the damn dirty humans," they realize they'd best use some magic to get the ship out of there fast. Try to follow the coastline to the Blue Elven Island kingdom of Dwaraka, and after landing on the neighboring island by mistake, astoundingly do manage to get there, are not well received by the ultra-high-tech Blue Elves, who promptly capture them, but at least the PCs manage to get the elves to take them anywhere from here, figuring that at this point they're better off being stranded in the southern continent with no conceivable way home than continuing to try their luck with the legless sea captain. End up being dumped by the Blue Elves in the nearest human-like occupied city, which turns out to be the City of Beggars. Promptly get ambushed by 100 or so beggar mutants, prompting the PC's new combat slogan, "What would Sandy do?" End up lucking out in that what Sandy would do, namely charging into battle against a force that outnumbers them 30 to 1, managing to scare the crap out of the mutants and cause them to retreat. Make the choice to leave the City of Beggars, heading south even though it's the opposite direction from High Bay, mainly because they're sick of the urine drinking stage. Stay tuned for more adventures on the southern continent. Title: DCC Campaign Update. I Am the Walrus Man. Date: August 5th, 2015. You've got to love the OSR. This last session I used not only the DCC rulebook, obviously, but also the AD&D DMG, the A D&D monster manual, The Adventures Dark and Deep DMG, Arrows of Indra, and Yunswen. I also glanced at the 5e monster manual for that matter. Most of the above, except the monster books, was for random tables. Anyways, this adventure saw the PCs meeting yet another group of noobs. In this case, we had a hippie herbalist, a green mutant cow cleaner, and a walrus. Man, that's the common name for them. They call themselves the Lulri. Discovering that, contrary to rumors, Lulri do not ride walruses, they ride yaks. Having Akbasha, the cleric, default leader of the PC group, volunteer the newcomers to join the party, by force. Learning that the walrus men worship the walrus Buddha, get harassed by a strike force of blue elves in power armor, who accuse them of having stolen an interdimensional portal. They talk their way out of it, but we're now left with the news that there's some group out there that does have that elven portal, and they've been promised a reward by the blue elves if they should happen to find it, and were given an elven comm beacon to signal if they do find it. We're given strict orders not to press the button that activates the beacon unless they find the portal, which of course makes Nigel the religious fantastic desperate to press it. Had their own potential ideas about the portal, particularly Akbasha, who was immediately thinking about how he could use it to get to his hated enemy, the Daemon Sezrekan. Started to run out of food as they traveled through the grasslands of the southern continent. Luckily, Rashid the cow cleaner has a vial of holy cow sweat on him, which Nigel quickly uses to summon and then slaughter a cow, much to Rashid's abject horror. Learned that trying to explain that this was not a regular cow but a magic cow only makes it much worse. Spending much of the next day's travel pausing to scrounge for any carrion bits of dead animal they can find, so that Nigel has a stock of material components for his animal summoning spell. Trying to find the portal with the help of clerical vision, but for this, divine approval is needed. So it's forced conversion time for the newcomers to the party. Going up into the Nanda Parbat Mountains, where they meet a caravan of giant goblin wizard merchants, who are protected by Spider-Man guards. The PCs confirm that Spider-Men do whatever a spider can. Trade the walrus man's carnivorous radish for some spiced cheeses. Learn that a group of elves had been spotted in the area and had crossed the Great Glacier. So, it's glacier crossing time. Felt they needed some more help. So Nigel invokes his patron Lariel the heretic, but all she does is gift him a pair of holy knuckle dusters to help spread the good word of God's love by beating the living shit out of anyone who refuses to believe. Encounter a very dangerous-looking ice dragon who appears to be the owner of the glacier. Manage to save their asses by virtue of the fact that both this ice dragon hates Bill the elf, and can confirm that Akbasha hates Bill even more. Note that the ice dragon had correctly assessed the newbies to the party as dragon fodder. Fortunately, he decides to let them all pass anyways, since he craves revenge against Bill, and thinks Akbasha might just be the cleric to get the job done. Note that Akbasha's crusade against Sezrekan has reached epic fame levels of notoriety, which may be helpful at the moment, but it also means Sezrekan has almost certainly heard about the whole quest for vengeance thing too. Get to the other side of the glacier, where there are a number of possible mountain passes. That would lead to the decrepit monastery that the PCs assume the elves went to. Akbasha's second sight tries to seek out the safe path to the monastery, only to discover that in fact there is no safe pass to the monastery. Find a creepy cave entrance surrounded by bones. When a wave of darkness starts to pour out of the cave mouth, they decide to cast light at the darkness, which is at least smarter than casting magic missile. Learn that in retrospect, magic missile might have been better, since the darkness was being generated by two extremely powerful fire demons. Know the meaning of fear, literally, because half the party runs away screaming and wetting their pants when one of the demons uses his emanate fear power. Mostly didn't stick around to see Nigel the religious fantastic call down the wrath of his patron Lariel the heretic. Unfortunately, said wrath was not quite enough, and Nigel is immolated one round later. Shul the rogue did stick around, not to help Nigel, mind you, but having made a safe bet that if he stayed hidden in the area he'd soon get to loot Nigel's charred corpse. And indeed he did. Saw Lariel return with Nigel too as reinforcements, only too late. Noted that Akbasha the cleric has been spending too much time with the religious fantastics, as he tries to baptize the walrus man with beer. Plan a careful sneak attack on the fire demons, only to have the hippie totally ruin it because he's stoned out of his gourd. Get totally screwed when the demon's combination of scare, sleep, and charm leaves everyone, except Shul, who was hidden, and the hippie, who had wandered off, incapacitated, watched helplessly as Shul made a desperate Hail Mary backstab attempt on the larger of the two fire demons, and then ran like hell when the hit didn't drop him. Assumed the worst when Shul caught up to the hippie, and declared that they were the new PC party from there on. Had a brief glimmer of hope as Nigel too recovered, only to have those hopes dashed as Nigel quickly became the second roasted religious fantastic in the span of 10 minutes. Had yet another glimmer of hope when Shul changed his mind and crept back over in time to see that Walrus Man had been torn to pieces by the demons. Noted that Akbasha is a heavy sleeper. Finally turned things around when Shul's insistent poking of Basha rouses him, and he calls down the divine wrath on the demons. Looted the lair, where they found a lot of skulls, a scale mail, some holy beads, some herbs, a lot of silver pieces, and a hover car. Discovered that the hippie herbalist can identify herbs, but he tells them the ones in the lair are not useful, because they're just magic herbs, and not the kind that can get him high. Divide the loot, with the cow cleaner getting the holy beads, the cleric getting the herbs, the thief getting the scale mail, Nigel too, who survived his burns, the bones, and the hippie gets kicked in the groin. Speculate that the hover car might have belonged to the blue elves who stole the portal, the first hint being that the car is blue. Take off in the hover car, resolving the problem of how to get 5 of them into a 4-person hover car by tying the hippie up Mad Max style to the front of the vehicle. Made the fateful choice of leaving the blue elf beacon behind in the demon cave. They did this after figuring out that the beacon might be tracking or even spying on them, and mainly after deciding that they really want to keep the hover car. They also start discussing the possibility of keeping the portal for themselves, too, or potentially destroying it. Remembering the rambling warning the King of Elfland gave them last adventure, where he had suggested that some elves somewhere could potentially cause the end of the world. Finally fly their way to the monastery, which turns out to be a really creepy, dilapidated monastery full of weird, dead-eyed monks. Confirm that, like most religious institutions everywhere, the monks are ranked according to how large and ridiculous their hats are. After refusing to just go away or accept that there's nothing for you here is a valid reason to take off, quickly figure out they're about to be attacked by 50 or so probably undead kung fu monks. Also end up finding the missing elves, who have also become undead monks, and the portal, which is in the process of being used in a creepy pseudo-Buddhist ritual that will apparently create a black hole of some kind, presumably to end the world. Score 1 for Grandpa Simpson Elf King's ramblings. Come to the conclusion that, in retrospect, getting rid of the beacons might have been a fatally bad idea. Start to drop like flies under the flurry of undead monk blows, and this time both the cow cleaner and Nigel -2 run out of luck. Score a surprising victory when they manage to take out the Grand Master of the monks, and all the rest of the monks deanimate. Also, they blow up the portal. Think it's all over now, except that it turns out that the Grand Master was being possessed by an incorporeal undead that now tries to attack them. The hippie decides it's a good idea to try to inhale the Grand Master and almost dies. Finally finish the ghostly Grand Master off, and now find themselves temporary owners of a corpse-filled monastery in the high mountains with no food. But that's okay, since they've got a hovercar to hightail it out of there with all the monastic loot they can carry. Title: DCC Campaign Update. All my friends are dead. Date: August 29th, 2015. This past session came as close to a TPK as our DCC campaign has ever seen. By the end of it, almost everyone was dead. How did this happen? Like this. 1. The PCs started out in a monastery. They decided in a spurt of optimism was not really an evil monastery, so much as a good monastery that had made some bad choices and fallen in with the wrong crowd. 2. They found their former accountant Sereth had now become a cleric. He's a neutral cleric, which means he's not really into it but just treats it as a job. 3. Said neutral cleric was determined never to sacrifice gold for divine approval. He's more of a prosperity Christianity style of cleric. 4. The PCs slept in the monastery, but not before demonstrating that they live a life of stunningly troubling paranoia. 5. Shul the Rogue found 3 evil-looking black scrolls in the monastery library in a skull motif cabinet. He decided this doesn't really look evil at all. 6. The PCs find an ominous-looking hidden shrine to the Lord of Death. The neutral cleric proceeds to use it as the bathroom. They find another set of secret underground rooms and start to realize that finding hidden doors is easier than assumed. 8. They start to get a bit too bored when the first underground rooms they find are exciting locales like the cloakroom, pantry, and the monastery well cistern. 9. They totally fail to spot, in their rush, the mutant sewer octopus thing in the cistern. The neutral cleric barely survives, but his brain damage reduces him to a vegetable, and it's time for a mercy kill. Monastery 1, PCs 0. Deset. They find an underground river where a venerable old yogi has been meditating in perfect stillness for 12 years. Of course, they decide to poke him with the hallucinogenic staff until he's forced to break his trance just shy of achieving nirvana. Jednact. They learn from the highly annoyed yogi that somewhere deep in the underground complex of the mountain below the monastery, there is an archgate to the Klipothic netherworld, as the monks call it, or as it is known to clerics, the recycle bin. If you can get through the archgate and get through all the insanely dangerous ordeals in the realm of death, you could theoretically try to resurrect a daemon that has been deleted. The PCs immediately decide it might be a cool idea to resurrect Tiamat, in spite of the fact that they were peripherally involved with the selfsame dudes who betrayed and murdered her. Divanact. They go back up for a rest and meet 3 newbies who were lost and made their way to the monastery gate. They're 2 mutants and a halfling, and the party debates whether that makes them 2.5 man or 2.5 half men. Trinact. Akbasha the cleric immediately press-gangs them into the party. Sitarnact. Akbasha also tries to sell the newcomers on joining his crusade to defeat Sezerkan and recover the sacred USB cable that would restore the world and purge it of all the abominations. You know, abominations like mutants and halflings. Patnact. Akbasha also tries to convert the newcomers, and is thus reminded that all halflings are new atheists and cannibals. Cessnact. The PCs do note that this particular halfling seems stunningly well-versed in philosophy, albeit of the sophomoric first-year philosophy student variety, for a half-feral murderous savage. 17. They go back down into the dungeons, and almost immediately run into some really big hobgoblins. They assume that these are locals at first, but will eventually learn that these goblinoids are here because they too are looking for the Archgate, to resurrect the daemon they worshipped. Awesomenact. They get into a rumble with these goblins, resulting the party getting the shit kicked out of them, killing the halfling and mutant too, and with most of the rest of the party being captured. Monastery 3 PCs 0. Devatnact. The captured PCs learn the tradition of how the goblins elect their replacement chief, the former chief having died. In the fight, which consists of the 2 main candidates beating each other with rocks until one is left standing. Devashat. The goblins also run into the yogi who kicks the shit out of them with some powerful magic. 21. The remaining free PC manages to convince the yogi to help, which he does by randomly summoning a trio of religious fantastics, all named Nigel, of course. 22. The 3 Nigels rescue attempt, consisting of charging straight at 20 goblins, proves disastrously ill thought out. Triokti Vende. Akbasha, the cleric's attempt to use his cursed power rings, doesn't work out as planned. 24. Akbasha then remembers his powerful holy beads, which cause harm to any chaotic being they even touch, so he proceeds to gently caress his captors with it to surprisingly great effect. 25. Akbasha then proceeds to cast a darkness spell in the surrounding area, and everything turns into a massive clusterfuck of a melee. 26. The rescue attempt having failed, Mutant One goes nuts, runs away, and then, in a bout of murderous insanity, tries to kill the yogi with a canoe oar. 27. The yogi survives, goes murderously insane too, and ends up beating Mutant One to death with a wooden begging bowl. Monastery 4 PCs 0. 28. Akbasha gets away, gets his armor on, goes back to the goblins' base, camp, kicks the crap out of the goblins there and takes their stuff. 29. The remaining goblins still in the dungeon find and finally kill the badly wounded Yogi. 30. Shul the rogue, who had been hiding out, attacks the remaining goblins in a desperate attempt to recover all the party's stuff before they get away. He kills the new chief with a very well-placed two-handed axe backstab. Unfortunately, the rest of the goblins make their morale check and butcher him. Monastery 5, PCs 0. 31. The few surviving goblins decide to hightail it out of the monastery and off the mountain. Akbasha, the cleric, is literally the last man standing. Monastery 5, PCs 1. It remains to be seen whether Akbasha will be led by these tragic events to consider whether his blood vendetta against Sezrekan is in some way responsible for the loss of all his friends and allies. But my bet is on no. He'll probably figure out a way to blame it all on Sezrekan too. RPG Pundit. Currently smoking Lorenzetti Oversize plus H&H's Beverwick. Title: DCC Campaign Update. Robot Necromancers and Night Goat State. September 20th, 2015. At the start of this session, we had Akbasha the cleric facing the devastating aloneness of being his party's only survivor. Only just after that, the hippie, who had buggered off into the mountains, came, back as a cleric now, and had brought a whole group of new friends with him. Among them was a boat swine, seafaring pigman, an untouchable with a third eye. That's good. Luck, apparently, a would-be warrior, a dwarf who wants to be a wizard, and some others. The untouchable's name is Mac Hammer, but he doesn't actually know the lyrics to Can't Touch This. The PCs learned that there's apparently some place called Knoll Aqua Base 1, found a book on necromancy written by someone named Bolt Zero, and were left wondering if it could possibly be the same conversation-loving robot they know by that name. Robot wizards are a problem in the world of The Last Sun. Already knew that God disapproves of a lot of stuff, but apparently the super frivolous use of divine aid to light a doobie is not one of them. Wondered if that counts as peer pressure from God. Come on, man, toke up, it's the divine will. We're left more confused by the fact that apparently God also approves of using neutralized poison to kill someone else's buzz. Quit goofing around and went back into the dungeon under the monastery, only to find some particularly feral halflings, and then a really creepy hallway with flickering lights that ends in an elevator door. Saw things in the hallway. May or may not have banished these things if indeed they ever existed. Engage in some vandalism and non-compliance of regulations in the creepy hallway. Discover that the elevator is in fact an elevator to hell. Learn that the elevator to hell is a one-way trip to a cave full of dire shadows. See the hippie cleric sacrifice himself. Realize that him shouting, "Run, you fools," as he was swarmed by shadows would have been a lot more awesome if there was some exit to run to. Manage to find said exit just as they were about to be overrun. Escape the cave of shadows only to end up in a mist-filled corridor. The hippie cleric is dead and turned into a shadow, while Akbasha is so drained by the shadows he can't actually move, needing someone else to make air quotes for him with their fingers while talking about the deceased hippie cleric. Ran into, while resting in the mist-filled labyrinth, a lost trio of noobs. They are an obese red mutant beggar who's surprisingly nimble, a Brahmin who got sick of his religious duties, and a squire with no knight, risked stepping back into the shadow cavern to dash and grab the dead hippie cleric's loot. Once again evade the shadows and then start getting semi-lost in the misty labyrinth, until they run into a six-armed fire demon, which they manage to scare off only with some holy water and the beads of demon repulsion, which they realize is the most important magic item they now have. Keep getting more lost in the misty underworld. They run into some toothy golem-like demons but turn those away with the holy beads too. Finally end up in a Mexican standoff with the fire demon prince, pissed off at their presence but unable to kill them. He makes a deal with them. Some asshole summoner has stolen away his pet night goats, and if he sends them back to the surface world, they will need to recover them. Presumably the demon's night goats will look a lot less adorable than this. Having agreed, are transported back to the surface world, finding themselves in a necromancer's magical summoning room, which turns out to be in High Bay. In fact, it turns out to be right in the High Council building. Discover that in their absence, Sandy the Warrior Queen and Gold Eater of Gold Halcon have escalated into a cold war with each other. Also, the Cyrillic Mafia and the Barata Mafia are in the midst of a very hot gang war. All this meaning the PCs have kept up their perfect track record of fucking up every place they visit. Finally discover that the necromancer room in the High Council building, in fact, belongs to Bolt Zero, the friendly conversation robot. It appears Bolt Zero did write that ancient book from the monastery, and is more than meets the eye. But what's his true agenda? Decide it's best to end the session there, to level up, and so that the GM has time to get ready for a trip. We return to DCC next week. Title: DCC Campaign Update. We're finally the lesser evil. Date: October 2nd, 2015. In the latest DCC session, the PCs were back in High Bay, the drug capital of the region, and got themselves caught up with a gang war in the town. While they waited to figure out what to do about Bolt, the potential necromancer, robot, and how to get back the Fire Demon Prince's night goats. In this session, the following things were overheard. It's hard to be an untouchable in a pie shop. Methamphetamines, Your Holiness. Akbasha the cleric survives by getting massive influxes of cash that he immediately blows on getting God to forgive him. My name is Natasha Natashchikova, darling. We shall meet again, tonight, actually. Zahar the dwarf wizard was looking for a quiet inn, and found one where you're literally not allowed to make any noise. Bolt, O's Guide to Necromancy is not the most well-edited of books. Akbasha has got himself quite the hippie cult. I was forced to break down the door to your temple with this hippie's skull. Vishal has gotten the group together to do a quest, which consists of meeting a gold mutant femme fatale at Third Bell because she said so. My name is Boris Hatsky, Goldenston. Natasha is my current wife and future mistress. Natasha did a makeover on the untouchable. Boris runs the Cyrillic Mafia, but his boss is Gold Eater, tyrant of the city, state of Gold Halcon. How powerful is Gold Eater? Powerful enough that every time someone says his name out loud, a little song plays in the air. What do you want? Gold. They can't give you any gold, they eat it all. Natasha broke the untouchable's heart, just like Boris had said she would. Akbasha is going to double-cross Boris. He's broken a lot of deals lately. You know, I'm starting to wonder if we're not actually the bad guys. Natasha did note that Akbasha reminds her of Rasputin. Akbasha also plans to kill Bolt. The dwarf wizard went to Jimmy the Ratcatcher to purchase rat parts before, remembering that every time he casts sleep, he summons a swarm of rats. Vishal and the Untouchable are going to infiltrate the Bharata Mafia by pretending to be a Brahmin prince and his servant. No way that can go horribly wrong. Akbasha and Zahar go to see Bolto at City Hall, only to learn he's now a city commissioner. Bolto learned necromancy from when he was a service robot at a necromancer's guild, and later wrote his book on necromancy. While living in a southern continent monastery, he's led a very interesting life for a bolt-tightening robot. Chief City Officer Swanley desperately wants to get us out of his city forever, except Akbasha reminded him that we may be the only ones capable of stopping Sandy, the dread barbarian queen, from destroying High Bay. We're finally the lesser evil. The Brahmin will have to control his reckless loins if we have any hope of keeping up this charade. The Untouchable has gone curry crazy over the cuisine at the Baratan Inn. So Akbasha doesn't just want to double-cross Boris. He wants to do it in the cleric's own temple of God. Have you noticed Akbasha's hippie cult talks less and less about praising God and more about praising Akbasha? So there's a third gang involved, and now the Vishal has to go meet the Draconians at the Den of 1,000 Lotuses and play Pai Gao with them to cement an Draconian Bharata alliance. And he's going to do it because now he really wants an elephant. The undercover guard's chief officer Swanley had infiltrated the area around the temple for the sting operation on Boris, and Natasha are really shitty at impersonating hippies. So wait, now we're working with the narcs? Akbasha orders all you hippies to shave off your hair to help the narcs fit in. So there's 3 gangs now. 4, if you count the city guard. 5, if you count Akbasha's cult. Our whole plan is becoming increasingly complex. You know, the cleric is becoming the new Bill the Elf. I guess if you stare long enough into the abyss, you become a self-serving asshole. Akbasha has now taken to wandering the streets of High Bay, looking for even more gangs to double-cross. Boris, okay, fuck this, kill everyone. Natasha, no, Boris, don't kill everyone, is a party. What about the city guard? They're all high. The attempt to get them to blend in worked too well. Akbasha saved us. Zahar, actually, it was me. Hail Akbasha! Vishal murdered the Cyrillic assassins, carried the unconscious untouchable, and wanted to loot the corpses. He's officially the worst Brahmin prince ever. Or, MC Untouchable is the most touchable untouchable ever. Bolt O will join you on this quest. Please wait momentarily while Bolt O gathers his necromantic tools in his magical murder box. What do you know? Vishal and the Untouchables defrauding the Bharata Mafia by pretending to be royalty actually turned out well enough to get an elephant out of the deal. Mac Untouchable was this close to getting a bunch of Bharata Mafia guards to join the quest, but Vishal said he'd be fucked if he was going to keep up the royalty act for the whole trip. That's it for this session. The PCs leave off departing High Bay, heading off in the direction of the Badlands and Yeti country, following the trail of destruction left by the Night Goats. Title: DCC Campaign Update, Giant Flesh, Ripping Weasels Redux. Date: October 15th, 2015. This week's adventure began with the PCs following the escaped Night Goats into the Badlands and Yeti country. They were being accompanied by their old friend Bolto, the bolt-tightening, conversation-loving robot who they'd recently learned was talented in the lore of necromancy. Incidentally, it had been almost exactly 1 real-world year since the last session they'd seen, Bolto, which tells you a bit about just how long-running and detailed this campaign is. Anyways, here are some more crazy things overheard this session. Bolto has never read George R.R. Martin, so wait, it takes Bolto a half hour of loudly issued commands to enter silent mode, but getting out of silent mode takes 2 seconds? Well, he is a conversation robot. Bolt Zero has a personality. That means that he's doing most of this shit out of choice. He could, in fact, help being a dick. Oh shit, not vicious flesh-ripping giant weasels again. The elephant got the first kill, unless you count the weasels killing the dwarf. Bolto's sensors indicate dwarf wizard is alive. Should Bolto exterminate? God must have something against this elephant. Giant weasels are the Badlands' deadliest predator. It's hard to spot the Night Goats' trail of destruction in the Badlands, what with everything here being fucked up already. We may be on the trail of the goats. I can see fire and shit. Guard mode activated, no danger detected. Wait, is guard mode the same as patrol mode? Yes. Bolt O eyes capable of using synonyms. When we're ready to attack, we'll signal you with the cry of the giant weasel, caw. I like how Akbasha has managed to turn Holy Sanctuary into a complete asshole spell. Only the Untouchable could survive a spear blow right through the head. Enlarge is the one spell every dwarf wizard wants. You can't solve everything by faking a heart attack. Giant weasels are the meth addicts of the animal world. This is what my DCC game is like. You have lost control of the giant weasel, not something you want to hear. Akbasha, I've made a huge mistake. Run away. Yes, you are still armed, both in the sense of still having your spear and still having your arm somehow. God is a bureaucrat. God is not a bureaucrat, he's a maniac. He used divine aid to cause religious genocide wouldn't be the first time. You all hear a mysterious silence. It's not really mysterious, it's because Akbasha gassed all the goblins to death. I note that at this point, the cleric has gotten pretty good at appraising gems. Bolt O was not aware that he is a fucking dick. Bolt O attempted to warn you of the dragon's presence, but he was still in sign language mode as per your request. Bolt O also has a jest mode, which he rarely uses. Akbasha is definitely turning into the new Bill the Elf. Casual genocide is one of the signs. Bolt O does not have a deceit mode, or does he? Call me the untouchable dragon slayer. Bolt O could attempt to summon the Lord of Death again, but it would most likely result in more goats. I wanted to change the details of the deal. How surprising of you, Akbasha. We can track the night goats by the burn trail they leave behind. Do they fart fire or something? We need to sneak up to the Yeti encampment. Oh yeah, because the elephant with the cowbell makes us particularly sneaky. The Yeti are coming. Cheese it. The party got away from the Yeti only to be attacked later. They managed to beat them off, and after banishing the last of the night goats back from whence they came, they were about to head home, only to find that in the cave of the dragon, which the untouchables slew with a single backstab attack, Bolt O has discovered a long, abandoned, functioning ancient transmat device, which apparently leads to a place called Living Unit 32. Obviously, the PCs decide they're going to go check it out. Title: DCC Campaign Update. Robots and Chickens Edition. Date: November 13, 2015. In this adventure, the PCs were considering whether to return to High Bay with a dragon horde they'd obtained, or go into the mystery transmat portal leading to somewhere called Living Habitat 23 in the ancient tongue, when all of a sudden, they were found by a trio of lost newbie adventurers. As tends to happen when Bolt Zero declares that unknown life forms detected followed by recommend. We enter stealth mode immediately, all while completely unable to modulate the volume of his voice. They discovered that 2 of the 3 newbies were immigrants from the southern continent, much like the Brahmin and Mac, untouchable. It turns out that some guy called the Serpent King has been conquering the small kingdoms of that continent, left and right, gaining in power every time he ritually sacrifices a king to his daemon patron. They learned that by a stroke of luck, the 3rd newbie was a beggar who happened to be an expert on the ancients. It turns out that in the world of the Last Sun, studying the ancients is like a bachelor's in unemployment. They were surprised by the newbies carrying 2 live chickens with them, in spite of being near starving. It turns out that the chickens were sacred to them. The untouchable's 3rd eye is also sacred. Apparently, on the southern continent, all kinds of stupid shit is sacred. They were stunned by Bolt O deciding to trust Akbasha the cleric with a secret. It wasn't the secret that was stunning, it was that at this point anyone would still trust Akbasha the cleric. Apparently Bolt Zero is an endless optimist. They discovered that Bolt Zero has a storage compartment in his torso, and it has a small skull in it, the size of a halfling's or a child. The PCs decided not to even ask him about it. They learned that Bolt Zero's greatest tragedy is that he cannot enter into conversation mode with himself. They chose to eat the day-old red dragon carcass, which turned into a great opportunity for the GM to refer to the dungeon dining table in his old but awesome forward to adventure Game Master's Notebook, also known as FDA, which is full of incredibly useful tables for your gonzo campaigns. They are awoken that night by Bolt Zero's intruder alert, and by the fact that 2/3 of the party are suffering from explosive diarrhea from having eaten that dragon meat. They discover they are facing a dozen deadly Chan trolls, the most ravenously violent and mindless trolls in the entire world. They are horrified to hear the Chan trolls literally tearing the Brahmin's elephant to pieces as they feast on his flesh. On the other hand, it's the only thing that saves them, since the trolls are too busy devouring the elephant to attack the PCs en masse during their moment of gastrointestinal vulnerability. They grasp the sophomoric infantile humoristic irony that the Brahmin was always a pretty shitty Brahmin, but now he's really a shitty Brahmin. They defeat the first wave of trolls, but realizing there's no way they're going to beat all of them, decide to rescue Bolt Zero, though none of them are quite sure why they would, and get onto the transmat to Living Habitat 23. They are transported to a strange retro-future underworld. It isn't dwarven, as the dwarf wizard confirms, so it seems plausible that they have actually been taken to the site of one of the ancients' own dwellings. They quickly discover that, like everything else in the world, Living Habitat 23 has gone to absolute shit. There's a computer terminal in the transmat room, but there's no interface, and no apparent way to turn it on, and Bolto does not have wireless capabilities. They encounter another robot. This one is called Chef 9, and when they hear her say foodstuff detected, entering cooking mode, they quickly realize that they are the foodstuff. The Brahmin slices off Chef 9's motor column, having just learned that robots apparently are easily mobility impaired. But before the PCs can question the robot, The Brahmin keeps right on going into a robot-killing frenzy that everyone agrees is clearly an act of vicarious slaughter to get out his frustrations with Bolt Zero. The Brahmin declares, satisfied, that he wants a cigarette after cutting Chef 9 into hundreds of tiny bits, once again proving he's a really shitty Brahmin. Bolt Zero makes a startling revelation. It turns out that one part of Bolto has a cigarette lighter. Bolto does not wish to reveal which part. Mac Untouchable tries to play the lute. Bolt Zero opines that Bolt Zero thinks you are murdering that instrument. MC Untouchable has a stunning plan. When they need to explore a mysterious kitchen, he ties a rope to himself and tells the group, I'm going in. If you hear me screaming hysterically, pull me back. MC Untouchable encounters a cowardly, hideous creature that looks like a cross between a dwarf and Dr. Zoidberg from Futurama. Bolt Zero analyzes the creature and comes to the conclusion of, Bolt Zero doesn't know what the fuck that the dwarf. Wizard also fails to identify the crab. Dwarf creature. This is not in the Book of Grievances. There's a huge hole in the floor of the mess hall. The Brahmin warrior decides to be lowered down to the next level on the rope, but just before reaching the ground he discovers the floor is electrified and barely escapes being fatally fried. I have a new respect for life, he says. It'll probably pass as soon as I have something to kill. Akbasha the cleric is willing to throw the hideous but clearly harmless crab, dwarf creature to its death to test out the electric floor. But this isn't a big surprise at this point. They all agree that by now Akbasha would screw over anyone in his party if he thought it'd help his revenge quest. Mac Untouchable comes to the conclusion that Akbasha must have had some very bad experiences to make him how he is now. Did you have something happen to you when you were a choir boy? No, but there was this one time the party had a guy who served the Lord of all flesh. The group comes to the obvious conclusion that they may have teleported into an ancient's living complex, but they definitely didn't teleport into becoming better people. They also realize that for the first time in ages they did not teleport from or into a bathroom. But then they remember that this time they used tech, not magic. Apparently only magical teleportation requires a bathroom as a material component. The Brahmin comes to a stunning self-realization. I'm not inflicting violence on anyone right now, and so I have to spend time thinking instead. I don't like it. The group finds a second mysterious non-functioning turbolift shaft, but it's full of little bits of glitter that turn out to be people eating nanites. They discover the nature of this terrible danger by throwing a defenseless crab dwarf at the nanite swarm. For once, this wasn't Akbasha the cleric's idea, and now he thinks this means he's suddenly not the asshole of the party. They manage to capture a sample of the nanites in one of the Tupperware boxes from the kitchen pantry. They toss the Tupperware at Bolt Zero, who's still on the other side of the hole in the floor, for him to analyze, but he's momentarily confused as to why his party members are throwing storage containers at him. They destroy the nanites with divine wrath. Making their way up the shaft, they find a lab with some cryo-stasis units, which include one that appears to be occupied by a young girl. One of the newbies suggests they try to test out the correct sequence for safely reversing the stasis process by stuffing the last surviving crab dwarf in a spare unit. You're going to fit right into this party, says absolutely everyone in it. The dwarf wizard's engineering skills prove able to work the cryo-stasis units. Now let's wake up the little girl. Everyone be ready to stab her. The young girl awakens, and it turns out she may be the last surviving ancient in the entire world. They decide to tell her about the cataclysm, the fact she's been asleep for over 10,000 years and that her entire species is probably dead. She's just a child. Hey, she needs to grow up sometime. The ancient girl, whose name it turns out is Alice, which everyone thinks sound elven, but she corrects them that elven sounds like ancient, demands that they get her to the control room to restore power. She says she wants this to try to contact the bridge officers, the meaning of which none of the PCs understand. But she also makes the mistake of answering the PC's question about whether there's an armory. There is, and the PCs decide to go there first instead. The ancient girl is not impressed with the PC's spellcasting. Your magic is an alpha primitive cargo cult of our technology. I didn't understand any of what she just said, but I feel like we should feel offended. She also apparently reveals that before the disaster, Cesra Khan was an AI program to teach children. Cue bad puns about Cesra Khan Academy. The ancient girl reveals a shocking fact. Apparently, there's no actual difference between ancients and humans. They are the same species, except the humans were alpha primitives, while the ancients called themselves the command crew. The PCs make it down to the armory level. There, they are forced to fight a guard robot, but they kill it off fairly easily. Unfortunately, the vault itself is magically, or ancient technologically, sealed. However, some divine aid manages to break it open. Unfortunately, most of the armory seems to have been emptied long ago, though they do manage to find a couple of laser swords and vibro swords, a box of cigars, a .45 pistol, an instant soup processor, and an ancient battle suit. By the party's standards, it's the fucking motherlode. Title: DCC Campaign Snacko Gator. Date: November 25th, 2015. We had left our heroes, and I use that term as loosely as imaginable. At this point, deep inside an ancient living habitat under the world, where they had found possibly the most amazing thing in the history of their adventures, a living ancient, albeit a child. But do they get this incredible girl out of the complex and to try to get her somewhere as secure as possible? No, they're going to keep right on adventuring with her, as if she was another member of the party. So now, the PC are up to going down deeper into the ruined complex, all except Bolt Zero, who is much too heavy for the rope or even manageably. For Alice, the ancient girl, to use her incredible nano-magic on. Bolt Zero has a weight problem. Akbasha the cleric, you'll go down first. Brahmin, yes, that's probably what's going to happen. Two of the three noobs head up on the transmat to the surface to see if the trolls have left. The third has graduated into a full-blown wizard. He is immediately nicknamed Ropatrick. Brahmin, you know, I kill people for fun, and I'm still less evil than the rest of you assholes. We probably shouldn't get too dependent on the little girl's powers. You are new at this, aren't you? Brahmin, I have no idea what you're trying to tell me, but I'm just going to break this thing anyway. Brahmin, if violence doesn't solve something, it's because you aren't using enough of it. Let's not leave the little girl alone up there. She's helpless and innocent. I bet you'll be eating those words before the end of the day. You've been with us a couple of days now. How can you not get that we're a bunch of psychos? The team finally leads the little ancient girl to the central control, but it's as offline as everything else in the complex. She comes up with the idea of trying to go down to the reactor to restart it. But first, they find themselves encountering several dozen security drones, which look like metal volleyballs with rotating knives and blaster eyes. After an initial melee round where they realize how deadly these things are, the party decides to cheese it out of the area and find a safer path. Alice is amazed by the cleric's use of healing, in the same way an anthropologist might be by a primitive tribe's folk healing practices. We need to find a bag or something. For all this loot, Alice, what's a bag? Well, that doesn't fill me with confidence. Akbasha the cleric tries to mine information from Alice about whether the machine's in. The control room could be used to get to Cesrican's plane. The dwarf wizard, one of only two PCs who can actually speak the ancient language, decides to fake Alice's answer to discourage Akbasha. Ropework, the newbie wizard, the only other PC who can speak ancient, narcs on the dwarf wizard, revealing that something called the Ascension Machine can in fact be used to get the party one step closer to a probably fatal end game to Akbasha's mad quest to take down the wizard, Damon. He's still clearly too new to get a decent self-preservation instinct. He knows not what he does. The team runs into a group of weird human, lizard mutants living in the lower levels of the complex, along with their pet snake, crocodile monster, immediately dubbed the Snacko-Gator. It is peripherally noted that dwarves can theoretically live for about 500 years, though they usually live far less on account of being dumbasses. The Brahmin, having been blue-balled in the fight with the security drones, is now determined to enjoy himself in slaughtering the lizard mutants. The dwarf wizard points out that he speaks lizard. No, not lizard, man, lizard. Thus, he can actually communicate with the Snacko-Gator, but not with the lizard mutants. The dwarf wizard helpfully translates the Snacko-Gator's hisses at the Brahmin. He's saying, "I'm going to kill you, bitch." The cleric gets to use his snake charm spell to great effect, marking in a single encounter the first time in the campaign that either snake charm or speaking lizard proved even marginally useful. The cleric tells the Brahmin that he's charmed the Snackogator, which the Brahmin interprets not as, you don't have to fight it anymore, but as this is a great moment for an attack of opportunity. Having slaughtered the lizard, mutants, and taken the injured Snackogator as a charmed pet, the party makes their way to the reactor room, only to find it is flooded with radiation. Brahmin, radiation? We can kill that, right? Rope work. The newbie wizard needs to spell burn to try to cast mend on the reactor, and he's required to sacrifice 2 of his most valued possessions. Conveniently, since he was a beggar just 24 hours earlier, his most valued possessions are highly shitty replaceable stuff. One of these days, Alice, with Ropework's mend spell having catastrophically failed, causing every metal weapon in the party's possession to rust, the plan is for the dwarf wizard to go in and try to fix the reactor with his dwarvish lore. He agrees only if Akbasha does a pre-emptive neutralize poison on him. The spell fails, but Akbasha, proving true to form, tells him it worked anyways. I can try to fix this thing. Dude, you're calling it a thing. You don't even know what it is. After the dwarf fails, and develops an as yet unrevealed mutation that will eventually prove tragically hilarious, Alice recommends the party get out of the reactor core before they all get 40 types of cancer. Reduced to trying to crawl through the service tunnels, Mac Untouchable saves Akbasha from a deadly trap. Akbasha promises he'll save Mac Untouchable when the team meets their destiny. Maybe. Akbasha, is that your primo staff, or are you just happy to see me? The scouting party returns from the service tunnels. We found the entrance to 3 rooms, one of which doesn't exist anymore. They don't mention they also saw a horrific tentacle thing in the tunnels. The Brahmin warrior finally manages to force open the sealed gates on the other side of the reactor core to the room that was full of water, flooding the core. The good news is this dampens the radiation. The bad news is that it also shuts down all remaining power in the complex. The party is now literally in the dark. They'd been there figuratively for much of the campaign. The party takes to using the last surviving ancient largely for her ability to create floating discs as impromptu elevator lifts. The party takes on another tribe of lizard, mutants and Snackogators. Tragically, MC Untouchable suffers a horrific death by Snackogator. He was untouchable, but he touched all of our hearts. The Brahmin finally gets a decent fight, one of the lizard. Mutants bites him and clings hard to his shoulder, so he decapitates him and keeps the head for the rest of the battle as a shoulder pad. The party agrees in the aftermath that the lizard mutant loot was so shitty it made them feel even better about committing genocide. Before camping down for the night, Akbasha graffitis the walls in blood to frame Bill the Elf for the massacre. That's the end of that session. Will the PCs manage to get the last young ancient out of the now doomed living habitat #23? Or will they end up being responsible for the death of the last living ancient? Stay tuned next time to probably find out. Title: DCC Campaign Log, Escape from Living Module 23. Date: December 9th, 2015. The PCs started the session still inside a ruined living module of the ancients, deep below the world. There they had found a single ancient, a young girl in a stasis pod, and now are determined to get her out of there, recognizing her potentially incredible value. Here were the interesting quips and events of the session. He's living for the moment. That's good. No, I mean he's living for the moment. The science brain is the only chance of finding out what happened to my people. We're probably going to end up destroying the science brain, you know. Why? Why do you always destroy everything? Shrug. Whatever mutation the radioactive core gave you, it's not going to get any worse than it is at the present moment. That's not reassuring. You can hear Bolt Zero from the top floor. He's in singing mode, raindrops keep falling on my head. Suddenly, the party is attacked by shadows. Is the Brahmin actually trying to talk the incorporeal undead? There's only two things you know about the insane witches of Fondling Hills. The first is that they're witches. The second, they're insane. They also live in a place called the Fondling Hills. The dwarf wizard cut off one of his own fingertips to spellburn. He really wants to do 4d12 plus LV damage against the shadow. And save his own ass, of course. Fuck, turn undead. It's time for divine aid. God is beneficent, but he's also useless. After the Brahmin takes 3 hits of friendly fire from Ropework the wizard and Dwarf Wizard's pistol shots stop helping. It's a special moment when the cleric realizes that divine light is really just the flash from the camera app in his tablet. The magic nunchucks you're wielding give you a really strong psychic sense that you want to destroy these motherfucking shadows. But then you probably already felt that anyways. I probably should have done this a lot earlier, but I now cast Holy Sanctuary. The warrior can finish off that last shadow, he can protect himself. Well, in theory. If the Brahmin warrior we just left back there dies, we're going to have to put death by shitbags on his tombstone, oh please. It's not like we're going to go back and bury the body. I'm not a psycho, I'm a dwarf. The party members have found 3 more cryo tubes, these ones having 2. Primitive humans, not ancients, a dwarven pharmacist, and a duck. Apparently, it was one of the human farmer's pets, a fact which caused great jealousy to the other human farmer. Does anyone here speak duck? I only speak lizard, spider, and worm, sorry. You didn't have any friends when you were younger, did you? Dude, please, I was an engineer. He used to hang out with all the lizards and worms, but not the cool worms. The juvenile ancient appears to have suffered psychological trauma. Bolt, 01 Cess, entering comforting mode. There, the Brahmin warrior, to the 11-year-old girl, stop crying and woman up. I think at this point the cleric ought to be officially in charge of the party. It makes sense. I'll be the last one left alive anyways. What's your name? I'm Dr. Akbasha. You're a pharmacist? So you use leeches? Have we gone backward in time? We found this thing called a seed pod. It says warning, and that it should only be used as directed. Q immediately pressing the activation button and releasing a cloud of deadly spores that kills one of the human newbies, and the duck. What a tragedy. He was a mighty duck. The party runs right into a corridor after hearing the mutants they were chasing very audibly being disemboweled. There, they encounter a 4-armed murder robot. Other 2 arms not shown. God damn it, I give you the primo staff for 1 second to fight the robot and you let it disarm you. The dwarven pharmacist tried to pick up the primo staff and now he's tripping balls. I knew it was a good idea not to warn him. Once again, between the 2 wizards and their firearms, the Brahmin has more back injuries from friendly fire than from the murder robot. It is unbelievably stressful to be the warrior in this party. Does my rage give me a bonus? Dude, your character is constantly enraged. You'd probably get a penalty if you ever weren't full of rage. I've cut off 2 of the fucking robot's arms and blinded him, and he just won't stop. It's the robot version of the Black Knight from Monty Python. The robot is finally slain, right after incapacitating the Brahmin warrior. His last words tell Bolt, "Oh hello. Why the fuck is it that all robots have exactly the same voice?" I put my helmet back on so no one can see my tears. The 11-year-old girl, to the Brahmin warrior, stop crying and woman up. You've sunk to a new low. You've just been dissed by a little girl. We've found the science brain. How much do you want to bet it's insane? Silence. Who are you and why are you here? The science brain. Why the hell does the science brain also sound like Bolt Zero? Silence. You are mistaken. Bolt, oh, and all other robots sound like me. Silence. This entire complex has been unexpectedly shrunken. Bedrock collapse ice imminent. Wait, you mean the dwarf wizard's misfire of the enlarge spell has doomed the last complex of the ancients? Silence. Yes. The party manages to just barely escape the collapsing complex on an escape rocket. It blasts them back to the inner surface and crash. lands on one of the flying islands. Yes, the world of the last sun has floating islands. The group immediately runs into deadly giant beetle, wasps. The Brahmin warrior is overjoyed at having a chance to regain his honor, only to be again incapacitated by a stinger. Dude, at this point that ancient exoarmor's main role is to hide your humiliation. We've killed off the beetle, wasps, the dwarf. Wizard's magic shield spell lasted just long enough to make him completely useless in the fight. The adventure finished off for the night with the PCs trekking across the grassland of the floating island, up the hills, and getting to an ancient tower, which was probably the rocket's pre-programmed destination. When they get there, in the middle of a thunderstorm, they are let in by a human in a Victorian butler's costume. "Good evening. You are just in time for Lady Norrington's party." Oh shit, I can smell a haunted house adventure coming on. Title: DCC Campaign Update. The Dark Ones revealed. Also, Sky, Nazis. Date, December 24th, 2015. We had left off with the PCs, along with a young ancient girl, Alice, just about to enter an ancient emergency shelter which apparently had been refurbished sometime in the past 100,000 years into a kind of Victorian mansion, by what would turn out to be yet another new race of elves, the posh elves. They arrived just in time for a dinner party and for a massive thunderstorm. It turns out that at the high altitudes of the floating islands at this level, such storms were so powerful that survival itself would be nearly impossible, meaning they were trapped inside the creepy mansion full of weirdos. Then all this happened. The human weaver became a wizard. He also had turned out to be something of a social justice warrior, making him a social justice warrior wizard weaver. The human butler's name is Jeeves, of course. There is a sudden surprise as a beam of light descends and takes away the cleric, Akbasha, Ropework the wizard, and the other noob that didn't become a LV1 character. Before they were teleported, a voice rang out calling to Akbasha, saying something like the Supreme Council of the Presbyterian Church requires your presence. And just like that, the characters belonging to players not available to show up this session were gone. The remaining PCs were introduced to Lady Norrington, who is basically an elven version of this, which means that they're in a gonzo fantasy ancient high-tech version of this. They met quite the ensemble of posh elves besides Lady Norrington's nephew Freddie, niece Lucy, her friends the Colonel and Sir Anthony Dashwood, who works for the Ministry, local respectables the Doctor, no, not that doctor, and the Vicar, the Cirrus Madame Theodora, and the famous elderly detective elf named Mrs. Maplebury. There are also a few other humans besides Jeeves, Lucy the maid, Jack the weird keeper of the botany lab, Pierre the cook, and Ted, a gunslinger from a nearby floating island called Cimarron, with a 6-shooter and 10-gallon hat. The latter is apparently dating Lucy, the social gall of which has set Lady Norrington into conniptions of shock. Posting this here because it's true, awesome, and vaguely topical in a way that probably won't come up on this blog anytime again soon. When inquiring to just what a vicar is, the PCs learn that it's like a posh elven version of a cleric, except that they can't actually cast spells and don't really believe in God. Oh, so it's pretty much like the Church of England. Gotcha. The Brahmin quickly decides he doesn't like Ted the gunslinger, and while the rest are exchanging pleasantries, he's exchanging death threats. Madame Theodora claims that someone will die tonight. It is foretold. The Brahmin answers, I just said I'm going to kill this guy. Exactly. It is foretold. The social justice warrior weaver wizard doesn't much care for the gruff, handlebar mustache wearing colonel. You're discriminating. Why, thank you. Is that mustache even real? Why, of course it is, you rapscallion. I won it in the last war. The dwarf wizard. The Brahmin is a holy man, Alice. He's a holy man. Dwarf wizard, yes. Well, Akbasha is more of a holy man. Alice, Akbasha first's a holy man. The social justice warrior wizard weaver goes to the bathroom hoping to go ethereal to snoop around. He discovers that there's an old magical teleportation pentagram there. For some reason, in this campaign, most teleportation spells happen in bathrooms. When he goes ethereal, he sees that the pentagram, which appeared to be inert, was actually radiating a strange dark light. Of course, he steps into the circle and gets sucked down into the circle by shadowy tentacles. When the social justice warrior Wizard Weaver appears to have vanished, Mrs. Mapleberry claims to deduce that the Weaver was a spy for something called the Sky, Nazis. The Colonel happens to think that Mistursky, Hitler, has some fairly good ideas. The PCs learn that the posh elves are the ruinous distant descendants of the once mighty empire of the Pythian Knights. Once they governed half the world of the last sun from the skies, but now they've retreated into their floating islands and their dusty towers. Alice reveals that she's an ancient. After some initial disbelief, Lady Norrington is convinced. She explains that long before the time of the Pythian Knights, the elves were the servants of the ancients, charged with keeping this island and others like it maintained as emergency safe spaces for the ancients. But the ancients vanished, presumably destroyed by the Dark Ones. Even so, Lady Norrington insists, this manor and all the lands of the posh elves actually belong to the ancients. And if this child is the last of the ancients, then she would be the rightful owner of all of Lady Norrington's wealth and estates. This does not go over well with Freddie, Lucy, or just about anyone else. Sir Anthony asks to use the communication room to contact the ministry about this new development. The Brahmin decides that's a bad idea and plans to kill him, but when they get to the comm room, they find that the storm has cut out communications. The tower is completely cut off. I say, why are you here? I was going to, do something. That something wasn't going to be killing Sir Anthony, was it? Maybe, why couldn't we have crashed on a floating island full of drunks? Oh, you mean Skye, Dublin? Pierre, the French chef, turns out to speak in a very thick German accent. Suddenly, the maid's blood-curdling scream alerts everyone to the fact that Lady Norrington has been murdered, with a wrench, in the library. Mrs. Mapleberry takes charge of the murder investigation. She starts off by interviewing everyone, one at a time. It is at this point that the Brahmin realizes the elderly elf woman has the hots for him. Hey, where's the ancient girl? I thought she was with you? God damn it, we had one job. As it turns out, Alice was in the drawing room with the ladies, but when the PCs go to find them, they discover the ladies unconscious, and Alice missing. The Brahmin kicks Theodora the seeress awake, to which she quickly states, I knew you were going to do that. The PCs figure out that Pierre, the fake chef and Skye, Nazi spy, had kidnapped Alice. They manage to catch him in the tower's hangar bay, capturing him and saving the girl. They tie up Pierre and ask Freddie to keep an eye on him, but Freddie freely admits that, being a bit of a thickie, he'd probably just end up having Pierre escape on him. So the Brahmin just decapitates Pierre. The social justice warrior Wizard Weaver shows up again, with a strange black hole in the middle of his body. Jack, the crazy groundskeeper, insists that the Dark Ones are here. He also reveals that he was a former adventurer much like the PCs, until he was left a ruin of a man, with broken hands barely useful for gardening. Why do we have a pirate now? I'm not a pirate, I be from the north. I think a lot of pirates must be from the north. I tell ye, it was the Dark Ones what took him. They changed him. They touched him in ways no man should know. Well, that part sounds about right. The Brahmin finally can't stand Madame Theodora claiming that totally obvious statements are accurate prophecies on her part and runs her through with a vibro sword. With her last words, she calls on her masters to avenge her. Meanwhile, the dwarf wizard, who is off on his own, gets suddenly kidnapped by a group of small, hideous creatures with little red hats that look a bit like dwarves but all wrong, and give off an aura that in every way feels like they should not be. They introduce themselves to the dwarf wizard as the Dark Ones, the beings who destroyed his civilization, were responsible for the loss of the ancients, drove God mad, and generally fucked up the whole planet. Though he, being a dwarf, knows them by their dwarvish term, gnome. Their leader introduces himself as Oogle Snuffler Poundbangler, Dark Lord of the Black Emptiness. This name generated courtesy of the random gnome leader name chart. In Gnome Murdered, cue one of my players totally losing his shit with amazement at realizing that the Dark Ones, which he'd been assuming would turn out to be Cthulhu-esque entities all this time, actually turn out to be gnomes. All of your friends' goals will come to naught. To be fair, my friends are really just making it up as they go along. The dwarf wizard finds out that the only reason he's still alive is because there is something deeply wrong with him, and this intrigues the gnomes. He is like us, and yet not like us. We shall have to discover the source of this. Bring out the probe. You all hear a third blood-curdling scream in the distance. When will we finally reach the limits of what can be discovered by probing in this campaign? The probing reveals that Dwarf Wizard had an ancestor that, at some point, had been mutated by the Dark Ones, gnomes, and the mutation had lain dormant through his lineage until it was activated by the massive radiation in the reactor of the Ancients' living complex. The Dwarf Wizard is not happy to hear that now he's as highly explosive as any other gnome, and will blow up if he falls or runs into a hard surface at sufficiently high speed. As expected, gnomes show up and start to murder everyone. The SJW Wizard Weaver realizes his torso is a gate to the gnomish void realm. It snaps his mind. The majority of the posh elves are as useless as most other elves in this setting, and die very quickly. A couple of the less useless ones, plus the cowboy and the Brahmin, fight very bravely, but in the end they're all slain. The Brahmin finally found something he couldn't manage to kill. The dwarf wizard wakes up for reasons he doesn't understand, but that are no doubt not in any way good. The gnomes spared him. For reasons he doesn't understand, they also replaced his hands with lobster claws. The dwarf wizard comes down to the scene of the slaughter and finds Alice missing, the SJW wizard insane, and the Brahmin dead. He starts to brutally kick the Brahmin's corpse, having apparently hated the vicious bully the whole time. Unfortunately, he hurts his foot. Even in death, the Brahmin can cause damage. There were a few survivors among the posh elves: the vicar, the doctor, Sir Anthony, Freddie, who is now Lord Norrington, Betty the human maid, and Mrs. Maplebury. Mrs. Maplebury immediately claims that it was Jack who had killed Lady Norrington, now that there's no way to confirm or deny it. She also claims that the SJW Weaver Wizard is a Sky Nazi spy. But the SJW Weaver Wizard is no longer interested in social justice. Instead, driven insane by the truth of being a living portable hole into the gnomish netherworld, he now only calls himself the Weaver, and decides he's going to kill just about everyone he can. The Weaver corners the vicar and tries to kill him with his chill touch, but the vicar's agnostic hymns may or may not be responsible for his spells not being cast successfully. Unfortunately for the vicar, they don't work so well at protecting him. From the vibro sword the Weaver took from the Brahmin's corpse. When asked why he killed the vicar, he claims the vicar had molested him. As everyone hunkers down to get some sleep, the Weaver sneaks into Lord Freddie Norrington's master bedroom and murders him too, trying to use the ropework spell to make it look like Freddie had accidentally killed himself in an act of auto-to-erotic asphyxiation. Sir Anthony, seeing where things are going, sneaks away in the early morning as soon as the storm breaks. He will turn out to be the only NPC survivor of Lady Norrington's dinner party. When day breaks, the survivors at Norrington Manor are surprised by the arrival of a trio of adventurers. Though really they shouldn't be, since that always happened right after a PC dies. Actually, it's two adventurers and a replacement butler. The dwarf wizard checks out the hangar bay of the tower, finding several hover cars and a Pegasus, the latter probably belonging to the dead cowboy. While checking out his new Pegasus, the dwarf wizard sees something approaching in the distance. Something that looks like Zeppelins. It's the Sky Nazis. The dwarf wizard very sensibly wants to tail it out of there. But the Weaver, being completely insane at this point, and having just finished murdering Betty and Mrs. Maplebury, totally wants to stay and meet the Sky Nazis. Again, because he's insane. How do we even know they're Sky Nazis? Well, the Zeppelins have swastikas on them. Are they Sky swastikas? No, that would just be silly. The Sky Nazis blow up the front entrance and demand to know where Pierre is, and more importantly, where the ancient girl is. The dwarf wizard wisely hid himself, but when the Sky Nazis find out that apparently Pierre is dead, and the gnomes kidnap the ancient girl, and especially when the Weaver just casually mentions that the gnomes came and left with Alice through a gate that appears in his torso, they decide to take the Weaver to be interrogated, presumably via torture, by the Sky Obergruppenführer. Those Sky Nazis are really rude. Dude, they're Sky Nazis, what the fuck did you expect? The dwarf. Wizard now plans to get the fuck out while the getting is good. But the sound of hovercar sirens makes it clear that the getting has just stopped being good. The dwarf. Wizard is presented with Chief Inspector Elephant of the Yard, who is here to arrest him, on suspicion of having something to do with the murder of the entire main branch of the Norrington peerage. Oh man. Is Akbash's player going to be pissed when he gets back and hears about all this? So, the session ends on a sort of triple cliffhanger worthy of a season to ender. One of the PCs has been nicked by the Yard, another is a prisoner of the sky, Nazis. The last surviving ancient is now a prisoner of the Dark Ones, who turned out to be gnomes. And we still don't know what the fuck the Council of the Presbyterian Church is. Also, it was pointed out to me that the sky, Nazis, were only the second worst villains in this adventure. Third worst if you count the PCs themselves. Stay tuned for more DCC fun in a couple of weeks, and Happy New Year. The PCs themselves. Stay tuned for more DCC fun in a couple of weeks, and Happy New Year.